right? So, cartoon that has been running since 1999 has managed to describe real-world events before they happened. Not once, not twice, but enough times that it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like something else entirely. That is what we are going to talk about tonight. Every case, every detail, every moment where the writers of Family Guy put something into a joke that, years later, the world confirmed. Get comfortable. This one is going to take a while. Part 1. Understanding the machine before we talk about what it built. Before we can go through the individual cases properly, you need a clear picture of how Family Guy actually operates as a creative product, because the mechanics of the show are directly connected to why so many of its apparent predictions look the way they do. This is not just background noise. The structure of this show, the way jokes are made and approved and broadcast, is the key to understanding almost everything we are going to discuss tonight. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999, right after Super Bowl 33 on Fox. Seth MacFarlane had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design and spent time working on animated shows at Hanna-Barbera before developing two short films, The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve, which became the creative prototypes for Peter Griffin and Brian Griffin. He pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in 1998. They commissioned it, and the show launched to an audience of approximately 22 million people who were already parked in front of their televisions after the game. That is one of the best launch conditions any television show has ever had. The show is set in a fictional New England coastal town called Quahog, Rhode Island, and follows the Griffin family. Peter is the broad, impulsive, not very bright patriarch. Lois is his wife, patient and long-suffering, and occasionally far more morally flexible than her presentation suggests. Their daughter Meg is a teenager who serves as the family's emotional punching bag for most of the show's run. Their son Chris is awkward and well-meaning. Baby Stewie is secretly a genius-level schemer with homicidal ambitions and an inexplicable British accent. And Brian is the family dog, talking, wine-drinking, failed novelist Brian, who exists as the closest thing the show has to a voice of reason. What makes the show structurally unique is the cutaway gag. A character will say something like, "This is worse than the time I," or "Remember when?" The scene cuts to a brief, completely disconnected visual joke, and then the story picks back up exactly where it left off. These cutaways became the show's signature. They were fast, dense with references, and because of their disconnected nature, they could go places that the main plot could never sustain. They could be as dark, as specific, as strange as the writers wanted, as long as they were brief enough that network standards and practices did not look too hard at them. That last part matters more than it might initially seem, and we will come back to it repeatedly throughout tonight. The show was canceled after its third season in 2002, largely due to Fox shuffling it around the schedule repeatedly and making it impossible for a consistent audience to find it. Then Cartoon Network bought the reruns for almost nothing and placed them in the Adult Swim late-night block, where they immediately became the highest-rated programming on the entire network. Adult Swim's viewership increased by 239%. DVD sales of the early seasons broke records for a canceled show. Fox looked at those numbers, reassessed their earlier decision, and brought the show back in 2005 for a fourth season. That 3-year gap matters. During those years off the air, the original writing staff scattered to other projects. When the show came back, MacFarlane himself acknowledged that one of the consequences of the show being repeatedly pulled was that they were always having to rebuild the writing room. New writers came in, some of the original team was gone, and across the revival years, the writing room became increasingly filled with people who were deeply embedded in the entertainment industry, well-connected, and in possession of a great deal of informal knowledge about how Hollywood actually operated behind the closed doors of the most powerful sets and production offices in the world. That is The Machine. A long-running animated comedy with a format that protects dark specificity, staffed by writers with unusually close access to the informal information networks of the entertainment industry. Now, let us talk about what that machine built. The apparent predictions fall into a handful of distinct categories, and it helps to understand those categories before we go through the individual cases, because not everything on this list works the same way. Some of these moments appear to be based on genuine inside information, things the writers heard through informal channels that had not yet reached the public. Some of them are the product of sharp cultural analysis, writers who understood the direction of travel in American society well enough to describe where things were heading before they arrived. Some are coincidences so extraordinary that they cannot be anything other than what they are, and some are a mixture of all three, impossible to fully separate. None of them require the supernatural. Every single case has a mundane explanation when you look at it closely enough. But mundane explanations do not always dissolve the strangeness of a moment. And the strangeness of some of these moments is very real. Let us start with the one that began the conversation in the public imagination. It is not the most precisely accurate entry on the list, but it is the story that made millions of people type Family Guy predictions into a search bar for the first time, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love knowing that someone on the other side of the planet is listening to the same words at the same moment. It is one of those small things that makes doing this feel worth doing. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. It is free, it takes 2 seconds, and it helps the channel reach more people who might appreciate this kind of deep dive. Right then, let us get into it. Part 2. The Boston Marathon. What actually happened versus what people think happened. The 17th of March, 2013. A Sunday night. Family Guy aired the 16th episode of its 11th season on Fox. The episode was called Turban Cowboy, written by Artie Johan and Sean Reese, directed by Joe Vo. It pulled a 2.4 rating in the 18 to 49 demographic and was watched by approximately 4,920,000 people, which made it the highest-rated show in Fox's Sunday night animation lineup that week, beating both The Simpsons and Bob's Burgers. The story centered on Peter Griffin befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud after a skydiving accident. They get along well. Peter converts to Islam somewhat impulsively. His other friends grow suspicious of Mahmoud, and eventually the episode reveals that Mahmoud is connected to a terrorist cell. Peter gets roped into a bombing plot without fully understanding what he has agreed to. Joe arrives to stop the plan, and the episode ends with Peter accidentally triggering explosions on a bridge by dialing his phone at the wrong moment, followed by the family running away into the distance. Critically speaking, the episode was not well received. The AV Club gave it a D, noting that it felt like it had been written in 2002 and left on a shelf, and that its handling of Muslim characters fell into lazy stereotyping. The episode tried to have a nuanced message about not prejudging people based on religion, and then completely undermined that message by making the Muslim character actually be a terrorist. As satire, it was Family Guy operating at significantly below its best. But inside the episode, buried in one of its signature cutaway gags, was something that took on an entirely different quality 29 days later. In the cutaway, Peter is asked about running the Boston Marathon. The scene flashes back to him driving a car through the race, knocking runners aside as a way of cheating his way to the finish line. Bob Costas appears to interview him, and Peter cheerfully describes what he did. The gag is dark in the characteristic Family Guy way, quick, and completely disconnected from the main plot. The episode also contains a separate scene, entirely unrelated to the Boston Marathon bit, where Peter accidentally detonates a bomb by dialing a phone. On the 15th of April, 2013, 29 days after the episode aired, two brothers named Dzhokhar and Tamerlan Tsarnaev placed 2 homemade pressure cooker bombs near the finish line of the actual Boston Marathon. The explosions killed 3 people. Crystal Campbell was 29 years old. Lu Lingzi was a 23-year-old graduate student from China. Martin Richard was 8 years old. More than 260 people were injured, and 17 of those people lost limbs. It was the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil since the 11th of September 2001, and the entire city of Boston was placed under a shelter-in-place order while law enforcement hunted for the Tsarnaev brothers. Within hours of the attack, a video began circulating online that made the situation with Family Guy dramatically more complicated. Someone had taken 2 scenes from Turban Cowboy, the Boston Marathon cutaway and the separate phone-triggered bombing scene, and edited them together into a single continuous clip. In the fabricated version, you see Peter at the Boston Marathon, then immediately see him triggering a bomb with his phone. Viewed without context and without the knowledge that these were 2 completely separate gags from different parts of the episode, The edited clip looked exactly like a continuous scene depicting a terrorist attack at the Boston Marathon. The clip spread with alarming speed. Conspiracy theorist and radio host Alex Jones was particularly instrumental in amplifying it through his InfoWars platform and on Twitter, framing it as evidence of foreknowledge. Within a short period, millions of people had encountered the edited version and were processing it as apparent proof that Family Guy had depicted the bombing before it happened. Seth MacFarlane took to Twitter almost immediately and called the edited clip abhorrent. He stated clearly that the event was a crime and a tragedy, and that his thoughts were with the victims. Fox moved fast. Within a day of the attack, the network had pulled Turban Cowboy from Fox.com, from Amazon, and from Hulu. They stated publicly that they had no immediate plans to broadcast the episode again. It stayed off streaming platforms for 9 years, not returning to Hulu until September 2022. Now we need to be precise about what actually happened, because the truth requires some careful untangling. The viral clip was a fabrication. The person who created it took two completely unrelated scenes and spliced them together to create a false impression of continuity. That is the foundational fact about the most widely circulated version of this story. The Family Guy predicted the Boston Marathon bombing narrative that most people encountered was based on a hoax. The actual episode, as it aired, does not show a bomb attack at the Boston Marathon. The car-through runners scene and the phone-triggered explosion are two different jokes from different parts of the episode, connected by nothing except the fact that they appear in the same 22-minute runtime. And yet, even after you fully understand that the viral clip was fabricated, you are still left with the real episode. And the real episode does contain Peter driving a car through Boston Marathon runners, in a joke that aired 1 month before real people were killed at the Boston Marathon. The episode does feature a storyline about a Muslim character being a terrorist. It does feature bomb detonations triggered by a phone. The topics were all there. The specific city was there. The violence was there. The terrorist plot was there, just not assembled the way the fabrication assembled them. The Boston Marathon is one of the most famous sporting events in America, and it takes place in New England, which is the exact region where the Griffin family lives. It would frankly be strange if the show had never referenced the Boston Marathon at all across its many seasons. The terrorist subplot was a separate piece of storytelling that critics had already identified as ham-fisted before the bombing ever occurred. No one sat down and wrote this episode with foreknowledge of what would unfold in April. But here is what the Boston Marathon situation actually accomplished, even as its central claim proved to be exaggerated. It made millions of people ask a question for the first time. Not whether Family Guy specifically predicted the bombing, because the honest answer to that is no, not really, but a different question. Had Family Guy predicted anything else? The answer, it turned out, was yes. And unlike the Boston Marathon situation, some of those cases were considerably harder to explain away, starting with the one where the show's own writers have been the most candid about what was going on, and where the evidence is most difficult to dismiss as pure chance. Part 3. Kevin Spacey and the Basement, the case that changed everything. The 5th of June, 2005. Family Guy was deep into its 4th season, riding the wave of its successful return from cancellation. Sunday night on Fox's animation domination block. The episode was the 4th of that season, titled Don't Make Me Over. It was primarily a Meg story, revolving around a makeover that temporarily makes her popular, leading to an appearance on Saturday Night Live that ends in humiliation. A fairly standard episode for that era of the show. In the middle of the episode, in a brief cutaway, baby Stewie Griffin runs naked through a crowded shopping mall screaming, "Help! I've escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. Help me!" He then collects money from Brian for completing the stunt on a dare. The camera cuts. The episode moves on. Those 3 seconds of screen time barely registered in 2005 as more than a random dark joke in a show full of random dark jokes. Kevin Spacey was one of the most celebrated figures in Hollywood. He had won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for The Usual Suspects in 1996. He had won the Academy Award for Best Actor for American Beauty in 2000. He was the lead of Netflix's critically acclaimed political drama House of Cards, playing the calculating and ruthless politician Francis Underwood with a chilling precision that won him Golden Globe nominations. Respected, powerful, a titan of the industry by any external measure. In October 2017, 12 years after that Stewie gag aired, actor Anthony Rapp gave an interview to BuzzFeed News in which he stated that in 1986, when he was 14 years old, Kevin Spacey had made a sexual advance toward him at a party in Spacey's New York apartment. Rapp's account described Spacey picking him up and carrying him to a bed. The story broke on the 29th of October 2017, exactly 3 weeks after the initial Harvey Weinstein reporting by the New York Times, and the New Yorker had set off the broader Me Too reckoning across the entertainment industry. The timing meant the infrastructure for these kinds of disclosures was already activated. Additional men came forward within days. 8 people who had worked with Spacey on House of Cards made allegations. A production assistant came forward with a more serious allegation. Former colleagues at the Old Vic Theatre in London, where Spacey had served as artistic director from 2004 to 2015, described a persistent pattern of predatory behavior across many years. The response was immediate and sweeping. Netflix suspended House of Cards production and ultimately ended Spacey's involvement entirely. The film All the Money in the World, directed by Ridley Scott, was in post-production when the allegations broke, and Scott made the extraordinary decision to reshoot all of Spacey's scenes with Christopher Plummer as a replacement, completing that work in 9 days to meet the film's release date. When the Stewie clip from Don't Make Me Over resurfaced, it happened almost instantly. Within days of the initial Rapp accusation, someone dug up the 2005 gag and posted it. The internet response was a complicated mixture of dark recognition, genuine shock, and an uncomfortable silence that was difficult to put into words. Stewie, 2005. Kevin Spacey. Basement. Escaped. A baby. Running away. The specific details of the joke were what made it impossible to dismiss as general randomness. The Simpsons' apparent predictions tend to involve broad topics, technological trends, political directions. This Family Guy joke did not reach for a broad topic. It named a specific person. It implied something specific about the nature of what happened in that person's space. It used the word escaped, which suggests captivity, which suggests something done involuntarily, without consent. When you encounter that joke with the knowledge of what came out in 2017, it is not a vague rhyme with reality. It is a fairly precise description of something specific. So, what was actually happening? The show's creative team has been more forthcoming about this particular moment than about almost any other case on this list, and that candor is itself revealing. Alex Sulkin, one of the writers and later a showrunner, gave an interview to The Hollywood Reporter in 2017 in which he said something worth reading carefully. He said, "We write things that we hear about, and then a year and a half later, they're on TV, and then 10 years later they happen." That sentence describes a pipeline. Something is heard as a rumor or whisper. It moves through informal channels. It finds its way into the writer's room. It gets shaped into a joke. The episode is written, produced, and aired. Years pass. The real thing becomes public, and suddenly the joke looks like prophecy. Seth MacFarlane addressed the Spacey situation directly as well. He said, "The Kevin Spacey thing is something I had not heard when it was pitched. The Family Guy writers have always had very open ears. And I think a lot of these things were things that were talked about and whispered about in Hollywood, but nobody had any direct anecdotal information about what was really going on. So all you had to work with was rumor." Read that again slowly. He says, the writers had open ears. He says these things were whispered about in Hollywood. He says nobody had direct anecdotal information, meaning no one was going on record, no one had a first-hand witness willing to attach their name to an allegation. All you had was rumor. The showrunner Appel added something crucial about how such material passes through production. The episodes are vetted by the Legal Standards Department, and either there has to be some basis for a joke or it has to be so insane and unbelievable that no one would take it seriously. And honestly, in some of these instances, both were true. Both were true. There was some basis for the joke. And the joke was also insane enough that no one would take it seriously as an actual allegation. A brief gag in which a cartoon baby screams about escaping from a famous actor's basement and accepts payment from a talking dog clears that standard with room to spare. It is, on its face, completely insane. No reasonable person watching it in 2005 would have interpreted it as a credible allegation against a real person. It was just a weird throwaway joke in a show full of weird throwaway jokes, except that the person who pitched it and the people who approved it may have been aware of something that made it less weird than it appeared. Not confirmation, not documented evidence, but something. A rumor, a whispered account, a piece of industry knowledge that everyone in certain circles had heard and that everyone in those circles had no way to act on. 12 years later, the absurdity turned out to be accurate in its broad outlines. The significance of this case is difficult to overstate. It is not just an eerie coincidence. It is evidence of a functional relationship between the informal knowledge networks of the entertainment industry and a show that was positioned, by its format and its connections, to receive signals from those networks and transmit them in a form the world could not yet process directly. The Spacey joke was not prophecy. It was a leak from a system that had no other available exit. The Writers Guild of America has tens of thousands of members. Writers who work on shows at the level of Family Guy move through industry events, social circles, and professional relationships that overlap with actors, directors, producers, and executives across the entire landscape of American entertainment. Information moves through those overlaps constantly, not through formal channels, but through the informal economy of industry gossip, which is vast, persistent, and often accurate in its broad outlines, even when the specific details cannot be confirmed to any journalistic standard. People in that world know things. Or they believe they know things. Accounts of powerful people's private behavior circulate in conversations that are off the record, in settings where the source would never be named, in exchanges that require a level of trust that makes formal disclosure impossible, not because of a coordinated conspiracy, but because the personal and professional risks of going on record are severe for anyone who is not protected by resources, legal support, and institutional backing. The people who had the most direct knowledge were, in most cases, in significantly more vulnerable positions than the men whose behavior they had witnessed, so the information stayed in informal channels. It circulated as rumor, as whisper, as the kind of thing that everyone in certain rooms had heard and that no one could say in a way that would produce accountability. It was known, widely known, but knowing and being able to say are different things. Family Guy's cutaway jokes about these men were one of the ways that trapped information moved through a sealed system, not a very effective way, not a way that helped anyone who had been harmed. A joke about Kevin Spacey's basement did not make it easier for Anthony Rapp to come forward, and it is important not to romanticize what the show was doing. The jokes were a way of knowing without acting, a pressure valve rather than an alarm. But they placed the information somewhere in the public record, in a form that could survive without triggering legal response, in a coded language that would mean little to most audiences and would be understood, if at all, only in retrospect. 12 years later, the encoded message was decoded by events. Part 4. Brett Ratner and the Trafficking Joke, the same mechanism, even darker. The 29th of April, 2012, Season 10, Episode 20. The episode was called Lego My Mego, a pun on Lego and the Mel Gibson action film Taken. The story followed the broad beats of that film, with Meg traveling to Paris on a student exchange program and getting kidnapped by human traffickers, leading Brian and Stewie to go to Europe to rescue her. In the episode, Stewie goes undercover as an underage girl at a trafficking auction to try to gather information on Meg's whereabouts. Various wealthy bidders bid on him. One of those bidders is announced as Brett Ratner, with a bid of $75,000. Brett Ratner, in 2012, was one of the most commercially successful directors working in Hollywood. He had directed the Rush Hour trilogy, generating hundreds of millions of dollars. He had directed X-Men, The Last Stand, and Tower Heist. He was the kind of figure present at every major industry event, connected to the financial infrastructure of mainstream Hollywood in ways that made him seem untouchable. In November 2017, 6 women came forward publicly to accuse Brett Ratner of sexual harassment and assault. The actress and model Olivia Munn gave a detailed account. Actresses Natasha Henstridge and Ileana Douglas described incidents that fit a pattern of someone who had been using the power of his position to behave badly for a long time. Ratner denied the allegations. Warner Brothers cut ties with him. His career essentially ended within a matter of weeks. When the Lego My Mego clip resurfaced after the 2017 allegations, the specific nature of the joke was what made people go quiet, not a vague implication that someone had behaved badly. Not a general joke about a powerful man's moral character. A scene depicting Brett Ratner bidding to purchase an underage girl at a trafficking auction. That level of specificity, that precise intersection of trafficking, minors, and a real named person, is not the territory of random comedy. Even by Family Guy's standards for dark material, a joke that specifically depicts a named real person participating in the purchase of an underage child requires something behind it. Alex Sulkin's explanation of the Spacey joke applies equally here. We write things that we hear about. The episodes are cleared because the material is either grounded in something real or so absurd no one would take it seriously. In the case of Brett Ratner bidding on an underage girl at a trafficking operation, both conditions appear to have been met simultaneously. 5 years after the episode aired, accounts of Ratner's actual conduct became public. Seth MacFarlane's own relationship to information about powerful men's behavior deserves one more look here. At the 2013 Academy Awards nomination ceremony, MacFarlane presented the Best Supporting Actress nominees and then said, after listing them, "Congratulations. You 5 ladies no longer have to pretend to be attracted to Harvey Weinstein." The line got an uncomfortable laugh from some of the audience. Most people treated it as a slightly odd joke about a powerful and not physically attractive producer. When the Weinstein story broke in October 2017, that moment from 4 years earlier became one of the most discussed pieces of footage from that ceremony. MacFarlane explained it plainly afterward. He said he had a close friend who had a troubling encounter with Weinstein, that he personally despised the man for direct reasons, and that the Oscars stage had been the only platform available to him to say something he could not say more directly. He used the only tool that would work in that context. He made a joke. That is not a Family Guy prediction in the technical sense. That is something more deliberate than most of the others. MacFarlane had information. He had reason to believe it. He could not substantiate it publicly. So he said it in the form that would cause the least professional and legal damage, while still putting the truth somewhere in the public record. The Weinstein joke, the Spacey joke, and the Ratner joke all share the same DNA. They are pieces of information wearing comedy as a disguise. Part 5. Caitlyn Jenner, 6 years before the cover. The 3rd of May, 2009. Season 7, Episode 17. We Love You, Conrad. The episode centered on Brian's love life, specifically on his discovery that his ex-girlfriend Jillian was getting married to someone else, and his brief doomed attempt at a relationship with Lauren Conrad, who voiced herself as a guest star. Brian and Stewie visit the set of The Hills, the MTV reality series, and encounter various people from that world. At one point, Brian and Stewie encounter Brody Jenner on set. Brody Jenner is the son of who was then publicly known as Bruce Jenner, the 1,976 Olympic gold medalist in the decathlon. Bruce Jenner had set a world record of 8,616 points at the Montreal Olympics, becoming one of the most celebrated athletes in American history. He had been on boxes of Wheaties. He had become part of the Kardashian extended family universe through his marriage to Kris Jenner. When Stewie expresses surprise that Brody came from Bruce Jenner's body, Brian corrects him. "Stewie, Bruce Jenner is a man." Stewie's response, "No, Brian. That's what the press would have you believe, but he's not. Bruce Jenner is a woman. An elegant, beautiful Dutch woman." In 2009, this landed as pure absurdist comedy. Bruce Jenner was widely understood as the embodiment of mid-century American male athletic achievement. The idea of describing him as an elegant Dutch woman was so categorically removed from public reality that it functioned as nonsense humor of the highest order. In April 2015, Bruce Jenner sat down with Diane Sawyer for a 2-hour interview on ABC watched by approximately 17 million people. Jenner publicly disclosed for the first time that she was a woman and had been experiencing gender dysphoria throughout her life. 2 months later, in June 2015, Vanity Fair published a cover story featuring Jenner, now named Caitlyn, photographed by Annie Leibovitz. The Family Guy clip from 2009 resurfaced almost instantly. Within hours of Caitlyn's Vanity Fair cover dropping, someone had found the "We Love You, Conrad" scene and posted it. The response was enormous. 6 years before the public announcement, a cartoon baby, talking to a talking dog, stated as declarative fact that Bruce Jenner was a woman. Not as speculation, not as absurdist exaggeration framed as wondering, as a factual correction to Brian's accurate at the time statement. "No, Brian, That's what the press would have you believe, but he's not. That framing does something specific. Stewie does not say, "Imagine if Bruce Jenner were a woman." He says the press is misleading you. He corrects a factual statement about the person's gender with a different factual statement. The joke works as a joke because the correction is so absurd. But the structure of it, the way it positions Stewie as knowing something that Brian does not and that the press does not, is unusual even for this show. The show returned to this territory in a season 10 episode called Lottery Fever, in which Peter calls Bruce Jenner to perform for Navy personnel. The scene depicts Jenner dancing in a distinctly feminine, performative style, with Peter remarking to the crowd, "Just wanted to remind you fellas what you're all fighting for." This was 2011, 4 years before the public announcement. The Snopes fact-checking organization assessed this case carefully and rated it as a coincidence rather than a genuine prediction. Their reasoning is sound. Jenner did not actually transition to being Dutch. The joke was not describing something Jenner had said or expressed publicly. It was absurdist comedy involving European femininity that had no direct connection to the actual circumstances of Jenner's transition. And yet the fundamental observation sits there, unchanged. Stewie states that Bruce Jenner is a woman. The framing is declarative. The show returned to the same territory twice. And when Caitlyn Jenner made her public announcement, the Family Guy clips went viral because they looked, to most people who encountered them, like something more than coincidence. Unlike the Spacey and Ratner cases, where the team offered reasonably direct explanations about hearing industry rumors, the Jenner moments were met with a different response. Mostly silence. Mostly declining to comment on the specific reasons for the portrayal. That silence is information. Not conclusive information, but information nonetheless. The show also had a precedent for being ahead of cultural conversations around gender and identity. The fact that it returned to the specific territory of Bruce Jenner's femininity twice, across 2 different seasons, in 2 different contexts, suggests something more than a single accidental gag. Whether that something was specific knowledge, persistent industry gossip, or a kind of cultural attentiveness that preceded the broader public conversation is impossible to determine from outside the room where those choices were made. What can be confirmed is the outcome. The cartoon baby was right about the fundamental fact. The timing was extraordinary. The Dutch part was wrong. The part that mattered turned out to be accurate. Part 6. The BBC Three broadcast and Robin Williams' pure coincidence at its most devastating. This entry is different from every other case on this list. It cannot be attributed to inside knowledge. It cannot be explained by access to informal Hollywood information networks. It is not the product of cultural extrapolation or sharp satirical analysis. There is no mechanism by which the people who made this episode could have known what would happen. This is coincidence. Pure, enormous, impossibly timed coincidence. The episode aired in the United States on the 20th of May, 2012. Season 10, Episode 22, titled Family Guy Viewer Mail Number 2. It was a 3-segment anthology episode structured around Brian and Stewie reading viewer letters. The middle segment was called Fat Man and Robin. In Fat Man and Robin, Peter Griffin is watching a Comedy Central roast of his favorite comedian, Robin Williams. When the roast takes cruel turns at Williams' expense, Peter loses his temper, runs outside in a thunderstorm, and yells at God that he wishes everyone in the world were Robin Williams. God, apparently taking the request literally, strikes Peter with lightning. When Peter wakes up, he has the ability to turn everything and everyone he touches into Robin Williams. Every person, every object, every surface he makes contact with transforms into the comedian. At first, Peter is delighted. He is surrounded by Robin Williams in every direction, but it does not take long for the situation to become overwhelming. The clones are inescapable. The joy has no edges. The brightness has no limit and no pause, and that absence of limit becomes its own kind of torment. Peter, desperate to stop it, begins attempting to end his own life. Each attempt fails because the means he reaches for transforms into another Robin Williams before it can do what he intended. He tries repeatedly. Eventually, he resolves the situation by cutting off his own hands to prevent further contact. The episode aired in America in May 2012. Robin Williams died on the 11th of August 2014. He was 63 years old. BBC Three had been airing reruns of Family Guy in the United Kingdom, and Fat Man and Robin was scheduled as a repeat for the night of August 11th. The broadcast began at 11:25 in the evening, British Summer Time. At approximately 11:50, as the episode was ending, news began breaking across British media that Williams had died. The timing was almost exact. Viewers in the United Kingdom who had been watching a Family Guy segment built entirely around Robin Williams, in which the main character makes repeated attempts on his own life while surrounded by an unstoppable and overwhelming expression of the comedian's image, looked up from their screens as the news came through about Williams's passing. A BBC spokesperson issued a statement. They said, "The episode ended just as the news broke about his death. This was a repeat that we have shown a couple of times before, so who could have planned that? It was scheduled more than 2 weeks ago, so it is just an uncanny coincidence." BBC Three pulled the subsequent repeat that had been scheduled for that Friday. Adult Swim in the United States quietly removed the episode from their rotation as well. In the days following his death, additional details emerged that made the episode even more difficult to contemplate. Reports indicated that Williams had attempted to harm his wrists. In the Fat Man and Robin segment, Peter cuts off his own hands to stop the Williams transformations. The mechanisms were entirely different, and the intent was entirely different. But the presence of hands, self-directed harm, and Robin Williams in the same 22 minutes of animation, broadcast the moment the news broke, created an overlap that viewers found impossible to sit with comfortably. Let us be absolutely clear. This is coincidence. There is no conceivable mechanism by which the Family Guy writers in 2012 could have known what would happen to Robin Williams in 2014. The episode was written and produced 2 full years before his passing. The BBC scheduling was made weeks in advance. Nobody planned any of this. If the repeat had aired the night before, nobody would have connected it to anything. But the timing was what it was. And the nature of the episode, its specific subject matter, and its central emotional architecture made the coincidence feel like something that required a response no one had words for. Because the Fat Man and Robin segment is, on some level, about what it feels like to be surrounded by an overwhelming, unstoppable force of joy that cannot be turned off. Peter gets everything he wished for. Robin Williams everywhere, all the time, every surface, and it destroys him. Not because the joy is bad, but because joy without edges is not joy anymore. Because the thing that makes someone extraordinary also makes them impossible to hold on to in a manageable way. Whether or not the Family Guy writers consciously intended any of that, the BBC Three moment gave it a context in which the episode became something else entirely. Not a prophecy. Something more like the universe providing, at the worst possible moment, a mirror that nobody had asked for. Williams was deeply beloved, not just by audiences, but by everyone who worked with him, who consistently described him as among the warmest and most generous people they had ever known. The quality of his public presence was something that had real weight. And the Fat Man and Robin episode had, somehow, been circling that quality, trying to understand what it would mean for something like that to be everywhere and inescapable. It is the case on this list that is most purely itself, not evidence of anything, not explainable by any information network or any pattern of cultural observation. Just the universe, briefly, doing something that felt like it ought to mean something, even if no one could say what. Part 7. Barry Manilow, Charlie Rose, and the Architecture of the Fall. Not every entry on this list carries the weight of the cases we have just been through. Some are gentler in their strangeness. Some work more like a slow double-take than a shock. But they all contribute to the same underlying picture of a show that was paying attention to things most other programming was ignoring, and filing observations in a form that could survive in public. The 17th of February, 2008. Season 6, Episode 9. Back to the Woods. The main plot involves James Woods returning to seek revenge on Peter by stealing his identity and moving into the Griffin house. But the episode opens with what seems like a throwaway setup. Peter, Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland all secretly attend a Barry Manilow concert, deeply embarrassed to admit they are devoted fans. In the concert scene, Manilow himself, voiced by the real Barry Manilow, singles out Quagmire from the audience and serenades him personally with an altered version of his 1974 classic Mandy, substituting Quagmire's name into the lyrics and turning it into a direct, intimate love song directed at a man. Quagmire, the character defined almost entirely by aggressive, heterosexual pursuit of women, receives this with obvious and genuine emotional warmth. In April 2017, Barry Manilow publicly came out as gay in an interview with People magazine. He was 73 years old. He revealed that he had been married to his manager Gary Keefe since 2014 in a private ceremony, and that he had kept the relationship private for many years. He said he had worried about his fans' reactions and had not been ready to say anything publicly until that point. When the Back to the Woods clip circulated after the announcement, the public reaction was mostly warm rather than shocked. The joke had always read as somewhat knowing, as though the writers were nodding at something while maintaining plausible deniability. The specific choice to have Manilow serenade a man on stage with a love song in an episode that aired 9 years before his public disclosure looked exactly like what it probably was. Writers who had heard enough about Manilow's private life through industry channels to make a wink and nod joke that most people would read as general camp comedy. No dark undertones here. No misconduct, no harm, no alleging anything troubling. Just a show gently indicating, in 2008, something that the singer himself would confirm in 2017. The gap between the nod and the confirmation was 9 years. Then there is Charlie Rose. Charlie Rose had been one of the most respected figures in American broadcast journalism for more than 2 decades. He hosted his own long-running interview program on PBS since 1991 and was a co-host on CBS This Morning. His long-form conversation style was considered a gold standard in television journalism. He was, in 2017, a respected elder figure in the American media landscape. Family Guy featured a cutaway in its episode, The New Adventures of Old Tom, in which local news anchor Tom Tucker loses his career. Peter compares Tucker's fall from grace to Charlie Rose, and the scene cuts to an image of Rose reading the news in a clearly compromised state, visibly suffering the after effects of heavy drinking from the night before. The joke is that this respected journalist has some private disorder that his audience does not know about. The gap between Rose's public gravitas and the private reality the show implies is the engine of the gag. In November 2017, The Washington Post published a story in which 8 women accused Charlie Rose of sexual harassment, including groping and nudity during work meetings. Multiple additional accusers came forward in the following days. CBS News suspended him immediately. PBS canceled his program. His career of nearly 3 decades was essentially over within a week. The show had predicted the specific shape of what happened, even if the details differed. The gag described Rose as someone with a hidden, disqualifying behavior that his audience did not know about. The reality turned out to be more serious than drinking on the job. But the architecture of the prediction, a prestigious media figure concealing something that would end his career, was accurate in its broad form. Family Guy got the structure right. The specific details were wrong, and that distinction matters for intellectual honesty. But having named Charlie Rose as someone whose public respectability was partly a fiction in the year before he was publicly exposed is still worth noting in any honest accounting of this phenomenon. Part 8, the vaccination episode and the pandemic. The 13th of November 2016. Season 15, Episode 6. Hot Shots. The setup is direct satire of the anti-vaccination movement. Baby Stewie needs routine vaccinations. Lois reads negative things online about vaccine side effects and falls into an internet research spiral that leads her to the anti-vaccination movement. She and Peter become advocates for not vaccinating children, hosting rallies, persuading their neighbors to stop, and creating a spike in the unvaccinated population around them. Brian argues against them throughout and is completely ignored. Then the consequences arrive. The unvaccinated children at Stewie's daycare develop measles. The outbreak spreads rapidly through the population that declined vaccination. The town is placed under quarantine. Lois has a change of heart and wants to get Stewie vaccinated, but Peter has already destroyed the entire local vaccine supply. The episode ends with the town locked down and the disease continuing to spread, a direct consequence of choosing social media health misinformation over established medical guidance. This episode aired in November 2016. COVID-19 began spreading globally in late 2019, was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization in March 2020, and would go on to kill more than 6 million people worldwide in the years that followed. One of the most significant and persistently damaging elements of the pandemic response, particularly in the United States, was the emergence of a large-scale anti-vaccination movement around the COVID-19 vaccines. People declined vaccination based on online misinformation, distrust of pharmaceutical companies, theories about side effects, and the same kind of internet-sourced panic spiral that Lois Griffin went down in the episode. Regions with low vaccination rates experienced significantly more severe outbreaks. Communities that rejected public health guidance went through extended lockdowns and quarantine cycles that looked, to many viewers who rewatched the episode during 2020 and 2021, strikingly similar to what the show had depicted 4 years earlier. Let us be precise about what this episode actually did and did not do. Hotshots did not predict COVID-19. The episode is specifically about measles, a long-established childhood disease with a long-established vaccine. Anti-vaccination sentiment had been a known and growing concern in the United States for years before the episode aired. The discredited 1998 Wakefield study, which falsely linked the MMR vaccine to autism, had generated a movement that was well into its second decade by 2016. There had been measles outbreaks in California in 2014 that were widely covered. The episode was not staring into the future. It was satirizing a present-day problem with real and documented consequences. What it did do was describe, with remarkable accuracy, the social and political architecture of how a large-scale pandemic response failure would play out. The shape of it, the way individual hesitancy accumulates into community vulnerability, the way online information ecosystems erode medical trust at precisely the moment trust in medicine is most necessary, the way the person who finally wants to do the right thing discovers that earlier choices have already made it impossible to do so cleanly. The quarantine, the destroyed supply, the cascade of preventable consequences. All of that was in the 2016 episode. And when COVID-19 arrived 3 years later and the response played out in ways that echoed Hotshots almost precisely, the overlap was real even if the specific virus was not. There is also a postscript that is worth knowing. In September 2021, as the COVID-19 vaccination campaign was underway and vaccine hesitancy was a major public health challenge, Seth MacFarlane and the Family Guy team produced a short animated piece in partnership with the Ad Council's It's Up to You initiative to encourage COVID-19 vaccination. In the short, Stewie and Brian travel inside Peter's body to explain how vaccines work and why they are safe. Peter gets vaccinated. The show that had depicted the catastrophic consequences of vaccine refusal in 2016 was, by 2021, using its characters to actively encourage vaccination against a real and ongoing disease. The episode was the warning. The short was the attempt to prevent the same ending. That arc across 5 years is genuinely striking. Part 9. Brian and the Cannabis Campaign, Rhode Island. 13 years later. The 19th of April, 2009. Season 7, Episode 12, simply titled 420. The episode aired the day before April 20th, which is observed in cannabis culture as an informal holiday centered on the consumption of marijuana, so the timing was deliberate. The story begins with Peter accidentally killing Quagmire's cat and trying to hide it, during which Brian gets arrested for marijuana possession after being caught by a passing police officer. Brian, once bailed out and put on probation, decides that the real response to his arrest is not to stop smoking, but to launch a public campaign for legalization. He and Stewie perform an enthusiastic musical number called A Bag O' Weed, set to the melody of Me Ol' Bamboo from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, Win Over the Town, and convince Mayor Adam West to legalize cannabis in the community. Crime drops, productivity rises, and Peter is too high to remember how to set up a cutaway gag. Then Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's wealthy father, loses money in the timber industry because hemp has replaced paper, and he bribes Brian into reversing his position by promising to publish his long-languishing novel, Brian Caves. The novel gets published and is immediately panned by every critic in America, selling not a single copy. 7,400,000 people watched this episode on its original air date. It received a 4.3 rating in the Nielsen 18 to 49 demographic. The Parents Television Council branded it their worst TV show of the week when it was re-aired in June 2009. The Venezuelan government reacted so badly to the episode that they banned Family Guy from their local networks. Justice Minister Tarek El Aissami stated that any cable stations refusing to stop airing the series would be fined, and the government displayed a clip of Brian and Stewie's musical number as evidence of the United States promoting drug use. Brian was awarded the 2009 Stoner of the Year award by High Times magazine, becoming the first animated character to receive the honor. This all happened in 2009, when marijuana was illegal for recreational use across the entire United States, with only a handful of states having medical programs. In May 2022, Rhode Island became the 21st state to legalize recreational cannabis, the state where the Griffin family lives, the state that Brian had specifically campaigned for legalization within. 13 years after the episode aired, the show had placed the story of cannabis legalization in the exact state where it later actually happened, more than a decade before it happened. This one works differently from the Hollywood Whisper Network cases. It does not require inside information. It requires the writers to have been paying attention to the direction American drug policy was heading in 2009, extrapolating from the growing public support for marijuana reform, and depicting the logical endpoint of that trend in the specific regional setting available to them. Public support for marijuana legalization went from approximately 41% in 2009 to 70% by 2023. The Federal Drug Enforcement Administration rescheduled cannabis to Schedule III in 2024. By October 2025, 24 states and the District of Columbia permitted recreational use. Brian won, eventually, just on a timeline that required more patience than he was ever capable of sustaining. Part 10. Antonin Scalia and the Hunting Trip. The episode is Meet the Quagmires, which aired in May 2007. It is a time travel story structured around death, giving Peter a chance to go back to 1984 to relive a night before he met Lois. Peter takes the opportunity and inadvertently changes the timeline, ending up in an alternate present where various things have shifted. Death walks them through the consequences of the changed timeline, including a mention that Dick Cheney killed several political figures while hunting, including Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. The Cheney hunting reference was already rich comedy material in 2007. On the 11th of February 2006, Vice President Dick Cheney had accidentally shot his friend Harry Whittington while the two were quail hunting on a Texas ranch. Whittington, a 78-year-old attorney, was struck in the face, neck, and chest with birdshot pellets. The incident became one of the most discussed events of the Bush administration's second term, generated enormous quantities of dark humor across every available platform, and was already deeply embedded in the comedy consciousness of the time. Antonin Scalia died on the 13th of February 2016. He was 79 years old. He died in his sleep while staying as a guest at the Cibolo Creek Ranch in West Texas, a luxury hunting resort. The cause of death was determined to be natural causes, most likely cardiac arrest. He had been at the ranch as part of a gathering that included other guests who had been on a quail hunting trip the day before. The episode had put Scalia, Dick Cheney, hunting, and death in the same sentence in 2007. 9 years later, Scalia died at a hunting resort. We need to be precise about the limits of this connection. The show depicted Cheney shooting Scalia while hunting. That did not happen. Scalia died of natural causes in his sleep. Cheney was not present. The cause of death that the show imagined and the cause of death that actually occurred are entirely different. What aligned was Scalia's name and the proximity of hunting to the circumstances of his death. Those are two overlapping data points. The story around them is completely different. This belongs in the catalog because the overlap is documented and was widely noted, but it occupies the most modest tier of apparent predictions. The broad association of Scalia and hunting and death was present in the 2007 episode. The precise story did not come true at all. Human pattern recognition does the rest. We see the name, check. We see hunting, check. We see death, check. The fact that the mechanism connecting those three elements was completely different in reality than in the fiction is the part our minds want to gloss over. It is worth resisting that impulse, because the distinction between a genuine overlap and a partial rhyme matters for intellectual honesty. Part 11. Will Smith at the Oscars, Peter and the Stage. The 27th of March, 2022. The 94th Academy Awards at the Dolby Theater in Hollywood. Comedian Chris Rock was presenting an award when he made a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith's shaved head, referencing the G.I. Jane film. Jada Pinkett Smith has alopecia, a medical condition causing hair loss, and had been open about her diagnosis since 2018. Will Smith walked from his seat to the stage and struck Chris Rock across the face with an open palm. It became one of the most discussed single moments in the history of the Academy Awards ceremony, which has been running since 1929. Within hours of it happening, someone found a clip from Family Guy. Season 3, Episode 8, Stuck Together, Torn Apart, which first aired in January 2002. In the clip, during a cutaway about Peter's jealous streak, Brian recalls a time Peter and Lois went to a concert. The singer on stage dedicates his next song to all the women in the audience. Peter, overcome with jealousy about a performer directing romantic attention toward his wife from a stage, charges down the aisle of the packed auditorium and punches the man behind the microphone. The clip was viewed over 1.5 million times in a very short period. Multiple journalists and social media users declared that Family Guy had predicted the Will Smith slap. The comparison requires careful calibration. The Family Guy cutaway from 2002 depicts a jealous husband assaulting a performer on a stage because the performer was directing attention toward his wife. The 2022 Oscars situation involved a husband striking a comedian because that comedian made a joke about his wife's medical condition. The emotional shape is broadly similar. The physical settings are similar. One involves a punch, one a slap, one involves romantic jealousy, one involves a medical condition. They share a category of situation. They are not the same situation. There is no inside knowledge dimension here. No suggestion that the writers had information about what Will Smith would someday do. The 2002 episode predates the entirety of the public's awareness of Jada Pinkett Smith's alopecia by 16 years. What happened is that a recurring type of scenario, a man on a stage says something in front of an audience, a spouse in the audience responds with physical confrontation, was depicted in a show that has depicted thousands of different situations across hundreds of episodes. When a real version of something broadly resembling that type of situation occurred at one of the most watched events in American entertainment, the existing clip found its audience. The parallel is genuine, visually striking, and genuinely funny to encounter. It belongs in the catalog. It just belongs in a different tier from the Spacey or Ratner cases, where specificity and inside information were the operative factors. Part 12. Iceman and Bobby Drake comics catching up 9 years later. In 2006, Family Guy aired an episode called Hell Comes to Town. In a brief cutaway, the X-Men character Iceman, also known as Bobby Drake, is shown sneaking into a gay bar. An obvious ice trail leads directly from his home to the bar's entrance, making the direction of travel impossible to miss. His wife is shown questioning where he goes when he leaves. Iceman was voiced in the cutaway by Alex Sulkin, one of the show's writers and later a showrunner. In 2015, the X-Men comics published All New X-Men issue 40, written by Brian Michael Bendis. In it, the younger, time-displaced version of Bobby Drake is outed as gay by Jean Grey, who has read his mind. The original, present-day Bobby Drake then confirms in the same issue that he is also gay, having spent years hiding it even from himself. He kept it hidden out of fear of additional persecution in a world that already treated mutants as subhuman. The disclosure was treated by Marvel as a significant story development. The confirmation that Iceman was gay in the comics came 9 years after Family Guy depicted him visiting a gay bar. Some readers of the comics were genuinely surprised. Others felt it had been building for a long time, that there had always been something in Bobby Drake's characterization that made the disclosure feel like it had been coming. And then there was the contingent who immediately went to the Family Guy clip from 2006 and pointed at it. The suggestion that Bobby Drake might be gay had been a topic of discussion in comics fan circles for years before 2015, based on close readings of the character's history and characterization. Whether the Family Guy writers were picking up on that fan conversation, or drawing on their own reading of the character, or operating in total creative independence of the later comics decision, is impossible to determine. What can be said is that a show produced by people with extensive pop culture knowledge made a specific joke about a specific comics character's sexual orientation in 2006, and 9 years later, the official comics canon confirmed what the joke had implied. The writer's room was made up of people who read widely and deeply in the pop culture landscape they were commenting on. Bobby Drake's orientation had been a topic of quiet conversation in certain corners of that landscape for a long time. The Family Guy cutaway was one of the places where that quiet conversation showed up on screen before the official record caught up. Part 13. Ellen DeGeneres and the Performing Warmth Problem. Let us talk about one of the quieter cases on this list, because not all of Family Guy's apparent predictions are dramatic or dark. Some of them are about the gap between a cultivated public image and a private reality. And in the television landscape, that gap, when it appears in relation to someone whose entire brand is built on warmth and relatability, tends to produce a particular kind of cultural reckoning. Family Guy featured a cutaway in its episode, And I'm Joyce Kinney, which aired in Season 9, in which Ellen DeGeneres is shown hosting her talk show. In the scene, Ellen repeatedly talks over her guests, barely allowing them to complete a sentence, dominating every exchange, making the people she is supposedly there to platform visibly uncomfortable. The joke plays directly against her established public persona. The warmth, the dancing, the be kind to one another sign-off that closed every episode of her daytime show for 19 seasons. In the Family Guy version, the camera-facing warmth is maintained, but the actual interpersonal dynamic in the room is something quite different. In 2020, reports began emerging about the working environment on The Ellen DeGeneres Show. Current and former employees described a production culture characterized by fear, intimidation, and mistreatment of staff. Multiple senior producers left the show amid a Warner Media internal investigation. Accounts described employees being told not to speak to DeGeneres directly, being disciplined for minor infractions, and experiencing a persistent gap between the show's public message of positivity and kindness and what it was actually like to work there day to day. DeGeneres issued a public apology to her staff and acknowledged that a culture had developed that did not reflect her stated values. The show's ratings declined significantly in the wake of the controversy. After 19 seasons, The Ellen DeGeneres Show ended in 2022. DeGeneres said publicly that being labeled as mean had affected her identity in ways she found difficult to recover from. Family Guy's cutaway had depicted the specific structural shape of what emerged: a performer projecting warmth and openness toward a camera while demonstrating something quite different in her actual interactions with the people in front of her. The gap between television persona warmth and actual interpersonal dynamics was the engine of both the joke and the later real-world story. How much of this was based on industry chatter that had been circulating in entertainment circles, and how much was sharp general observation about the gap between what television personalities perform for cameras and who they actually are in the building, is difficult to separate. Both mechanisms could produce the same joke, and both were available to a writer's room full of people who worked in the entertainment industry and had extensive opinions about how television warmth is constructed and maintained. Part 14. Bitcoin, the throwaway mention that aged uncommonly well. In 2015, Season 14, Family Guy aired an episode in which Peter and Lois face financial anxiety about Stewie's future college costs. Peter, doing what Peter does when confronted with a practical problem, makes an offhand mention of Bitcoin as a potential solution. The joke frames it as a lottery ticket approach to personal finance, the kind of thing a person like Peter would suggest because it sounds exciting and requires no actual planning or discipline. In 2015, Bitcoin was not the global financial instrument it would later become. It existed, had been circulating since 2009, and had a devoted following in cryptography and technology communities. It had also experienced some high-profile controversies, particularly the collapse of the Mt. Gox exchange in 2014. To a casual observer in 2015, Bitcoin was still primarily a curiosity rather than a mainstream investment asset. In the years after the episode aired, Bitcoin's value and mainstream visibility increased dramatically and repeatedly. By late 2017, it had reached nearly $20,000 per coin before crashing. By November 2021, it had reached approximately $69,000 per coin. It spawned an entire ecosystem of competing cryptocurrencies. entered the financial mainstream in ways most people would have found unlikely in 2015, and became the subject of congressional testimony, major institutional investment, and entirely new categories of financial product. The Family Guy mention noted the asset before most of its explosive growth and prominence. Peter Griffin, suggesting Bitcoin as a financial strategy in 2015, looked, in retrospect, like a better investment observation than most of what professional financial commentators were producing at the time. The causation question here is essentially a joke. Bitcoin's market movements are driven by enormously complex global forces. A Family Guy cutaway does not move cryptocurrency markets. But the cultural fingerprint is real. The show referenced a then niche financial technology before it became ubiquitous, connected to a character who famously makes impulsive decisions that occasionally turn out to be accidentally correct. Part 15. The UK Internet Censorship Prediction. In A Family Guy cutaway, Peter flips through television channels and lands on what he describes as sophisticated British adult programming. What follows is a parody of British sexual restraint. The couple in the content considers and then decides against physical intimacy, and when they do finally end up in bed together, there is no movement, everything is covered to an extraordinary degree, and the whole production is so inhibited as to be essentially inert. The joke is about English cultural repression expressed through the specific medium of entertainment content. In 2017, the United Kingdom passed the Digital Economy Act, which included provisions requiring age verification for adult websites. The implementation, which became known colloquially as the UK porn block, required adult content websites to implement age verification systems before allowing British users access. The law went through various delays and technical challenges, generated significant public debate about internet privacy and the potential for the verification infrastructure to be extended toward broader censorship, and became one of the more contentious pieces of British digital legislation in years. The Family Guy joke had depicted British adult content as already essentially censored by cultural convention and social restraint. The actual law went further, placing a legislative framework behind what the show had been depicting as a cultural joke. This is a loose connection, and honest accounting requires acknowledging that clearly. But the show had specifically positioned British sexual culture as moving toward institutional restriction, and that restriction then arrived in real law. Part 16. Why this pattern exists: the science of what was actually happening. We have been through 15 specific cases now. Let us step back and think about the phenomenon structurally, because understanding why this keeps happening is as interesting as any of the individual cases themselves. The first and most important answer is that Family Guy has been producing content for more than 25 years. The show has aired over 450 episodes and generated tens of thousands of individual jokes, cutaways, character observations, and cultural references. At that volume, spread across that duration, statistical collisions between fictional content and real-world events are not just possible, they are inevitable. If you make enough statements about enough subjects across enough time, some of them will eventually find their referent in reality. The law of large numbers is not a satisfying answer to the most dramatic cases, but it is the baseline that any honest accounting has to start from. That baseline does not fully account for the most striking cases, and here is why. The moments that are hardest to explain away are not broadly topical, they are specifically named. The Kevin Spacey joke does not say, "A famous actor will one day behave badly." It names Kevin Spacey. It implies a specific type of behavior. It uses specific language. That specificity requires something other than statistical inevitability. That something is the Hollywood Informal Information Network. The entertainment industry in America is large by some measures and very small by others. The Writers Guild of America has tens of thousands of members, but the number who are actually in rooms where sensitive informal information lives is far smaller. Writers who work on shows at the level of Family Guy move through industry events, professional relationships, and social circles that overlap with actors, directors, producers, and executives across the entire landscape of American entertainment. Information moves through those overlaps constantly, not through formal channels, but through the informal economy of industry conversation, which is vast, persistent, and often accurate in its broad outlines, even when specific details cannot be confirmed to any journalistic standard. People in that world know things, or they believe they know things. Accounts of powerful people's private behavior circulate in conversations that are off the record, in exchanges that require trust between the parties that makes formal disclosure impossible. Not because of a coordinated conspiracy of silence, but because the personal and professional risks of going on record are severe for anyone who is not protected by resources, legal support, and institutional backing. The people who had the most direct knowledge were, in most cases, in significantly more vulnerable positions than the men whose behavior they had witnessed. So the information stayed in informal channels. It circulated as rumor, as whisper, as background knowledge that everyone in certain rooms had heard and that no one could say in a way that would produce accountability. Family Guy's cutaway jokes were one of the ways that trapped information moved through a sealed system. Not a very effective way, not a way that helped anyone who had been harmed, but a way that placed the information somewhere visible, in a form that could survive in public, in a coded language that would mean little to most audiences and would be understood, if at all, only in retrospect. Then there is a second, distinct category of apparent prediction that works entirely differently: cultural extrapolation. The Hot Shots vaccination episode is the strongest example. The writers were not in possession of information about a future pandemic. They were observing present-day trends in American public health discourse with unusual clarity, and they dramatized where those trends would lead. They got the general shape right because the shape was already visible to anyone who was paying close enough attention and was willing to follow the logic of existing trends to their natural conclusion. Good satirists have always had this capacity. They see the present clearly enough that the future, which grows directly from the present, comes into reasonable focus. It is not prophecy, it is extrapolation. The difference between a satirist who sees clearly and a prophet is that the satirist is reasoning from evidence. Family Guy was reasoning from evidence in its best cultural analysis moments, and the evidence it was reading turned out to support conclusions that arrived on schedule. Then there is the third category: pure coincidence. The BBC Three broadcast timing for the Robin Williams episode, the Paul Walker and Brian Griffin car accident coincidence. These cases exist because the world produces enough events that some of them will occasionally rhyme with pieces of existing fiction in ways that feel significant. The feeling of significance is real, even when the mechanism producing it is chance. None of these three categories requires the supernatural. All of them have mundane explanations. But mundane explanations do not always dissolve the experience of sitting with these moments. And that experience has its own reality. Understanding the mechanism does not reduce the strangeness of a moment like the Spacey case or the Robin Williams broadcast timing. It contextualizes it. It tells you where the strangeness comes from without making it disappear. The information was real. The analysis was real. The coincidence was real. What they share is the effect of producing a specific kind of recognition. The feeling that a cartoon was describing the world before the world had fully articulated what it was. Part 17. Paul Walker and Brian Griffin, The Week of Two Brians. The 24th of November, 2013. Season 12 of Family Guy. The episode was titled Life of Brian. Across that season, there had been hints that something significant was building involving the family dog. Brian Griffin, the talking, wine-drinking, perpetually aspiring novelist family companion, who had been one of the show's most beloved characters since the first episode in 1999, was about to have his story change permanently. At the end of Life of Brian, Brian is hit by a car in front of the Griffin home. The injury is severe. He does not recover. Brian Griffin dies in that episode, surrounded by the family. The response was enormous. It made national news across the United States. It trended across social media platforms for days. People were genuinely upset in a way that surprised even some of the show's most devoted observers. Brian had been a character for 14 years. He was the voice of reason, the failed writer with the dry wit, the one who could understand Stewie when no one else could. His loss landed hard. The family grieved. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, was brought in as a replacement companion. The show continued. Then, on the 15th of December 2013, just 2 episodes after Life of Brian, an episode called Christmas Guy aired. Stewie, who had received a time travel device in the earlier episode, uses it to go back and save Brian from being hit by the car. Brian came back. Vinny was returned. Everything reset. Critics and fans were nearly universally scathing about the reversal. It was widely understood as a temporary stunt designed to generate attention and emotional engagement before the status quo was restored. But here's what happened in the middle of all of that. On the 30th of November 2013, 6 days after Life of Brian aired, actor Paul Walker died in a car accident in Valencia, California. He was 40 years old. Walker had been the star of the Fast and Furious film franchise since the original film in 2001, playing Brian O'Connor, a street racing enthusiast and former police officer. He died when the Porsche Carrera GT he was riding in as a passenger lost control and struck a concrete lamppost and 2 trees. His friend and business partner Roger Rodas, who was driving, also died. Paul Walker had been deeply beloved, both by his enormous global fan base and by his colleagues in the film industry, who consistently described him as warm, generous, and genuinely kind. His death was a shock. The Fast and Furious franchise's tribute to him in the 7th film, completed after his passing, remains one of the most emotionally resonant moments in the history of blockbuster cinema. The final scene of Furious 7, which ended with a CGI Walker driving off down a sun-drenched road as the song "See You Again" played, made people cry in theaters around the world. Brian Griffin died in a car accident the week of November 24th. Brian O'Connor died in a car accident on November 30th. Same week, both named Brian, both vehicles, 1 week apart. When people noticed, it spread everywhere. 2 Brians, 2 cars, 1 week. The overlap was specific enough and the emotional weight of Walker's death heavy enough that the coincidence produced a particular quality of shock that was difficult to process. The Family Guy clips circulated alongside Walker tributes. The 2 events, entirely unrelated in any causal sense, were linked in the public consciousness for that brief period by the accident of their timing. There is no mechanism by which the Family Guy writers could have known what would happen to Paul Walker 6 days after their episode aired. The decision to kill Brian Griffin had been made months earlier in the production process. No intelligence, no information network, no whisper in any Hollywood corridor could have predicted that one of the most famous fictional Brians in American culture and one of the most beloved real Brians in American entertainment would both lose their lives in car accidents in the same week. This is pure coincidence. The universe providing a rhyme that nobody asked for. Family Guy later honored Walker in a brief and respectful tribute in a subsequent episode, a show that had accidentally shared a week of fictional loss with his real one. Some coincidences are just sad. This is one of them. Part 18. The Anatomy of How Jokes Become Records. We have traced enough individual cases now that it is worth examining, in more detail than we have so far, how the mechanism actually worked in practice. Because the picture that emerges from the research is specific enough that we can describe it with reasonable confidence. A Family Guy episode takes roughly 9 months to produce from initial story break to final air date. The process begins in the writer's room, where story ideas are pitched, refined, and assigned. The writers come from across the television comedy landscape. Some have spent years in that particular room. Others cycle through. They attend industry events. They have friends and colleagues across the entertainment world. They are connected to the same social and professional infrastructure that connects all of the entertainment industry's working population. In that environment, information circulates, not through formal channels, not in ways that would constitute evidence for a journalist or actionable material for a lawyer, but as conversation, as gossip, as the shared background knowledge of people who work in the same world and talk to each other at industry events and guild functions and the same social circles. When someone in the room pitches a joke that names a specific famous person in a compromising context, that pitch goes through several layers. The other writers respond to it. The showrunner considers it. It passes through Fox's Legal Standards and Practices Department, which assesses the legal risk of the material. The standard, as Sulkin described it, requires that the joke either has some basis in fact or is so absurd and unbelievable that no one would take it seriously as an allegation. A brief gag in which a cartoon baby screams that it escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement and then accepts money from a talking dog for completing a dare clears that standard easily on both counts simultaneously. It is, on its face, completely insane. No reasonable person watching in 2005 would have interpreted it as a credible allegation against a real person. It was just a weird throwaway joke in a show full of weird throwaway jokes. Except that the person who pitched it, and the people who approved it may have been aware of something that made it less accidental than it appeared. Not confirmation, not documented evidence, but something. A piece of industry knowledge that everyone in certain circles had heard, and that everyone in those circles had no formal way to act on. The cutaway format was the enabling mechanism. A brief disconnected gag protected by its own apparent absurdity, placed in a show whose entire identity is built on brief, disconnected gags, is essentially invisible to legal scrutiny. It is not a scene. It is not a character arc. It is not a subplot. It is 3 to 15 seconds of apparently random comedy sandwiched between two other pieces of apparently random comedy, and it moves on before anyone has time to look too closely at it. What that format allowed was the filing of information in a publicly accessible archive in a form that could not be challenged, because it could not be taken seriously enough to challenge. The joke was the container. What was inside it was sometimes something else. 12 years later, the apparent absurdity turned out to have been accurate. This is one of satire's oldest and most legitimate functions, even when it is operating largely unconsciously. The court jester who says the thing the king cannot punish because the king cannot admit he understood it. The comedian who names the thing powerful people do not want named, wrapping it in enough absurdity that denial remains technically available to everyone involved. What is unusual about Family Guy is not that it did this. Satirists have always done this. What is unusual is the scale at which it operated, the duration over which it sustained itself, and the archive it created in the process. Hundreds of episodes across 25 years. A searchable, replayable, permanently accessible record. When the world finally caught up with things the jokes had apparently described, the evidence was right there, 3 to 15 seconds long, filed in plain sight. Part 19. What power does with information it cannot afford to lose. Every single case in the most credible tier of these apparent predictions has something in common. They all involve powerful men whose private conduct was dramatically inconsistent with their public personas, men whose behavior was known informally in certain circles, but could not be formally addressed because the conditions required for formal disclosure had not yet been assembled. Kevin Spacey, Brett Ratner, Harvey Weinstein, Charlie Rose. These were all situations in which men with significant cultural, financial, and social power had been conducting themselves in ways that caused serious harm to people with less power, primarily younger or less established individuals who were dependent on the goodwill of those above them in the industry hierarchy. The reason those behaviors persisted as informal knowledge rather than becoming public information sooner was not that nobody knew. The people with the most direct knowledge of what had happened were, in most cases, in significantly more vulnerable positions than the men they had experienced. The powerful men had lawyers, reputation, the ability to end careers without leaving a paper trail. The people who had experienced the harm faced enormous personal and professional risk in speaking publicly without the documentary evidence and legal protection that makes formal disclosure survivable. So the information stayed in informal channels for years, circulating as rumor, as whisper, as background knowledge that everyone in certain rooms had encountered and that no one could convert into accountability. It was known, it was present, it had weight, and it had no adequate exit. Family Guy's comedy was one of the ways that trapped information moved through a sealed system, an inadequate way, an indirect way, a way that placed the information somewhere in the public record without helping anyone who had been harmed, without producing consequences for the men involved, without changing the conditions that allowed the behaviors to continue. It is important not to romanticize what the show was doing. The jokes did not help Anthony Rapp. They did not help the women who came forward about Brett Ratner or Harvey Weinstein. They were, in the final analysis, a way of knowing without acting, a pressure release from a system that needed more than pressure release. But they placed the information somewhere, in a form that survived, in a form that was public even if it was inaccessible to most people who encountered it. And when the conditions finally changed, when the combination of willing accusers, journalistic infrastructure, and cultural shift necessary for the Me Too disclosures finally assembled, the coded information was there to be decoded. The jokes became evidence, not of the specific acts but of what was known. Evidence that the informal knowledge networks of Hollywood had contained this information for years and had found no adequate channel to move it. Evidence that the silence was not ignorance. Evidence that powerful men had been, for a long time, protected not by the absence of knowledge but by the absence of the conditions required to make knowledge actionable. Family Guy did not create Me Too, but some of its most striking apparent predictions are documentation of the conditions that made Me Too necessary. They are evidence of how long this had been going on and how widely it had been understood in the circles where it was happening. The show did not just sometimes predict the future. In some cases, it was recording a present that most of its audience could not see. Part 20. The Quiet Accumulation, Smaller Predictions, and Cultural Drift. We have spent most of this video on the major cases, but there are smaller entries worth touching on because they add texture to the overall picture, and some of them are genuinely interesting in their own right, even if they do not carry the dramatic weight of the Kevin Spacey or Robin Williams cases. The show depicted what appeared to be references to the Middle East conflict in 2023, in an episode that aired nearly a year before the most acute phase of the crisis, with background articles in a scene touching on themes that subsequently became globally significant. This one requires significant qualification. The Middle East had been a subject of persistent international news coverage for decades, and any references would have a reasonable chance of remaining topical. Some viewers found the specific overlap striking. Others pointed out that the region's volatility made any reference potentially relevant at almost any future date. The show made a joke in an early episode involving a musician whose aesthetic resembled an artist who would later become prominent before that artist had any public profile. This category of case requires the most caution, because aesthetic resemblance between fictional characters and later real figures is one of the loosest possible forms of apparent prediction. The overlap consists of a visual similarity that viewers noticed after the fact, rather than any specific named or implied connection. A cutaway in the show depicted an encounter with Vladimir Putin that some fans, after Putin's escalations in Ukraine beginning in 2022, interpreted as having predicted his strategy of projecting strength while offering unexpected cooperation. This is a very loose reading of a brief gag, and the connection requires considerable creative interpretation to hold together. Putin has been a consistent subject of political comedy for decades, and the range of possible jokes about him is large enough that some of them will resemble whatever he actually does later. Family Guy also featured an episode in which Peter and Lois discover a sequel to Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, which they depict as a Rush Hour-style action comedy involving Jesus and Chris Tucker. Gibson has discussed a Passion sequel publicly for many years. Whether that project will eventually materialize remains unclear, but the show staked out that specific territory long before it became a topic of active industry conversation. These smaller cases belong in the catalog but in a different tier from the major examples. They are interesting, they are genuinely documented, and they contribute to the overall texture of a show that was paying attention to a wide range of cultural, political, and industry developments. But they require less explanatory weight. The major cases are the ones that demand serious engagement. The smaller ones are the background hum. What the full catalog adds up to, small cases and major cases together, is a picture of a show operating across multiple registers simultaneously. As a repository of Hollywood inside information at its most specific moments, as sharp cultural analysis in its steadier moments, and as the occasional subject of extraordinary coincidence. The proportions vary from case to case. Sometimes it is impossible to separate the categories cleanly. Part 21. Seth MacFarlane, the person at the center of all of it. Any complete accounting of this phenomenon has to sit with Seth MacFarlane as a figure, because he is the connective tissue between almost every case we have discussed. MacFarlane is genuinely one of the more interesting figures in recent American entertainment, and not simply because of what he created. He is someone who built a show that made its reputation on being able to say things that could not be said elsewhere. He used that reputation to do things that most creators in his position would not have done. He walked picket lines with writers during 2 separate strikes, in 2007 to 2008, and again in 2023, even when shows he created were affected by the work stoppage. He made a joke about Harvey Weinstein at the 2013 Oscars that was a calculated use of a prestigious public platform to put information somewhere it could not easily be retracted. He eventually signed a deal with NBC Universal worth reportedly around $200 million that moved his production company away from Fox, in part because of his discomfort with the broader Fox ecosystem. He has also been notably inconsistent in his candor about the show's apparent predictions. The Spacey and Ratner explanations were offered with relative openness. The Caitlyn Jenner moments were met with near silence. The Boston Marathon situation was handled with urgency appropriate to a fabricated clip being used to imply a connection to a real tragedy. Different cases received different levels of engagement, and the pattern of which cases received which treatment is itself informative about what the show's team was comfortable acknowledging. In April 2024, MacFarlane gave an interview about the show's future in which he framed its continued existence primarily in terms of financial utility, both as a revenue source and as a funding mechanism for causes he cared about, including environmental conservation, through organizations like Rainforest Trust. He said the show had reached what he called escape velocity, meaning it had been going long enough that there was no logical reason to stop unless audiences stopped caring. He said there was a time when he had thought about wrapping things up, but that the numbers and engagement had not provided a clear signal to do so. What was not present in that description was creative passion. There was no mention of stories he was burning to tell, directions he was eager to explore, characters whose unfinished business was keeping him engaged. The show was continuing because the infrastructure for it existed and the business case held, and because it served purposes that were real and legitimate, even if they were primarily financial rather than artistic. In April 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had secured a renewal deal with parent company Disney, extending the show through season 27 to the 2028 to 2029 television season, which would coincide with its 30th anniversary. Each season would consist of 15 episodes. The show that had debuted to 22 million viewers in 1999 was now watched by fewer than 1 million people in its most recent seasons, and was being locked in for several additional years regardless. The reason is the economics. Animated shows are significantly cheaper to produce than live action. No expensive physical sets. Voice actors record in a booth. Animation is produced overseas. The operation is lean. Family Guy also generates revenue far beyond its first-run broadcast. Reruns on Adult Swim, Comedy Central, FXX, and other cable networks, streaming rights on Hulu, merchandise across dozens of product categories. International syndication in markets around the world. The money Family Guy makes comes from the entire ecosystem built over 25 years, not primarily from how many people watch new episodes on Wednesday nights. The show had become a product that continued to be manufactured because the economics supported its continuation, even after the creative ambition that originally drove it had largely moved on to other projects. That is simply what happens to successful properties over long enough time spans. What is worth noting, for the purposes of this specific discussion about apparent predictions, is the relationship between that transition and the density of striking cases across the show's history. The most compelling moments, the Spacey case, the Ratner case, the cultural extrapolations that held up best over time, cluster in specific eras. They came from periods when the writer's room was at its most engaged, most plugged in, and most creatively ambitious. The later seasons have continued to produce episodes, but they have not generated the same density of moments that look, in retrospect, like foreknowledge. That is consistent with what we would expect from a show whose apparent predictions were driven by the quality of attention and the depth of engagement available to its writers at a given moment. The archive of the show's best apparent predictions is, in a meaningful sense, also an archive of when the show was being made by people who were most fully present in the work. Part 22. The full accounting every case placed on the spectrum. Let us put the complete picture in one place. Because after all this ground we have covered, it helps to have a clear-eyed summary of where each case actually falls on the spectrum from compelling to coincidental. The most credible tier, where the apparent foreknowledge is hardest to explain as simple chance, Kevin Spacey leads this category. Full stop. Named, specific. Describing a particular type of behavior involving a minor. Aired 12 years before the public allegations. The show's own writers have confirmed the mechanism. Industry rumors, converted into jokes that could pass standards because they were both grounded and absurd simultaneously. This is the strongest case for the Whisper Network explanation in the show's entire history. Brett Ratner in Lego My Mego belongs alongside it. Same structure. Named, specific, depicting a type of conduct that would later be publicly alleged by multiple people. The same showrunner offered the same explanation for both. The second tier contains cases that are compelling, but where the evidence is somewhat less direct. Caitlyn Jenner in We Love You, Conrad. A cartoon baby states as declarative fact that Bruce Jenner is a woman, 6 years before Jenner's public announcement. The show returned to the same territory twice. The creative team has been notably silent about the specific reasons. The unusual directness of the claim, stated as a factual correction rather than speculation, makes it genuinely difficult to dismiss. The Barry Manilow case in Back to the Woods belongs here too, with the show's specific joke structure suggesting awareness of something that would be publicly confirmed 9 years later. The third tier contains genuine and well-documented moments that function through cultural extrapolation. Hotshots in the COVID-19 vaccination dynamics is the standout. The show described the social architecture of a vaccine hesitancy-driven community health failure in 2016, with enough accuracy that the cycle it depicted played out in recognizable form during the actual pandemic. The Brian Cannabis Campaign from 420, set in Rhode Island 13 years before real legalization, belongs here. Charlie Rose in The New Adventures of Old Tom fits a similar pattern of the show, naming someone as carrying a hidden disqualifying behavior in the year before that behavior became public. The fourth tier contains genuine coincidences that are extraordinary in timing but unpredictable in mechanism. The BBC Three broadcast timing and the Paul Walker Week both belong here. These are cases where the universe produced rhymes that no human intelligence anticipated and no human intelligence could have anticipated. They carry emotional weight precisely because they are not explainable. They are just the world briefly doing something that felt like it should mean something, with no underlying reason for that feeling to exist. The fifth tier contains cultural observations that aged well, but do not require special explanation. Ellen DeGeneres' public image gap, Iceman's sexuality, Bitcoin's mainstream ascent, the UK's internet censorship legislation, the Will Smith Oscars incident. These are the show doing good cultural analysis or experiencing loose thematic overlaps with later events. That is the complete picture. Taken as a whole, it describes a show that was operating across multiple registers simultaneously, as a repository of Hollywood inside information, as sharp cultural analysis, and as the occasional subject of extraordinary coincidence. The proportions vary. Some cases sit cleanly in one category. Others require acknowledging that the categories overlap. Part 23. What satire can do that journalism cannot. There is a structural argument worth making here, because it explains the Family Guy phenomenon at a level that goes beyond any individual case. Journalism operates on evidence. A reporter cannot publish a story about a powerful person's misconduct without sources willing to go on record, documentation supporting their accounts, and legal protection sufficient to withstand the inevitable response from the target's lawyers. Assembling all three of those things takes time, often years. During that time, the information that would eventually constitute the story exists in informal channels as rumor and whisper and background knowledge. Fiction can say anything, because it is not claiming to describe reality. Characters in a novel can do things that real people do, and the author is protected by the clear, fictional frame. This gives fiction a freedom that journalism cannot have. Satire occupies a specific and historically significant position between those two things. It is fictional in form, but referential in intent. It points at the real world while wearing the costume of comedy. It can name real people. It can imply real behaviors. It can do so under the protection of comic exaggeration and the structural argument that it is obviously not meant to be taken as a literal, factual claim. What Family Guy's best apparent predictions represent is satire doing what satire has always been theoretically capable of doing, serving as a vessel for information that the culture cannot yet handle in its direct form. The Kevin Spacey joke is a line connecting back through centuries of court jesters and political satirists who used comedy to say things that power could not suppress, because power could not officially acknowledge understanding what was being said. The difference between ancient Athens and Hollywood in 2005 is scale and medium. The function is identical. Understanding this does not reduce the significance of the individual moments. If anything, it increases it, because it means that Family Guy's apparent predictions are not accidents in their most compelling cases. They are evidence of how information moves through systems and what happens to it when the formal channels are blocked. They are the shape of things known but unsayable, finding the only form available to them. The jokes were the container. What was inside some of them was something else entirely. Part 24. The broader cultural texture. How the show read the world. Beyond the dramatic individual cases, it is worth acknowledging the quieter layer of the show's cultural intelligence. Not the spectacular moments that generated national headlines, but the accumulating texture of accurate observation that runs through hundreds of episodes across a quarter century. Family Guy has been watching the transformation of American media consumption since 1999. It observed the shift from appointment television to on-demand viewing before most of the industry had fully processed what was coming. It depicted algorithmic recommendation culture, infinite library paralysis, and the specific frustrations of subscription service proliferation with a granularity that most entertainment properties were slow to engage with. These observations were not predictions in the dramatic sense, but they represent a consistent attentiveness to how the media landscape was changing. The show has also maintained a persistent engagement with the specific mechanics of how American political culture was fragmenting over the same period. From the early Bush years through the Obama era and into the hyper-partisan landscape of the 2010s and 2020s, Family Guy was charting the erosion of shared information environments, the way media consumption became identity signaling, the way political anger became a permanent condition rather than a response to specific events. It did this through comedy, which meant it could be dismissed as simply offensive or simply liberal, but the underlying observations about the direction of travel held up consistently. The healthcare system, the opioid crisis, the gig economy, the specific indignities of navigating American social services while being poor. These were not just topics that the show touched on occasionally. They were recurring subjects engaged with a specificity that went beyond the broad comedic strokes most shows applied to social commentary. The writers were clearly reading about the world they were depicting, paying attention to how it actually worked, and finding the specific details that make a joke feel true rather than merely topical. None of these accumulate into single, memorable prediction moments. They are the ambient texture of a show that was paying attention to a wider range of things than most of its audience realized it was tracking. The spectacular individual cases got most of the attention. The quieter ongoing observation was what made the show, at its best, something more than the sum of its cutaways. Part 25. The Shape of the Archive. The show has generated thousands of hours of content across its run. In that archive, there are the cases we have discussed, the ones that became famous in retrospect, but there are also undoubtedly cases that have not yet found their real-world referent. Jokes and observations and specific implications that sit in the archive right now, unremarked and unexamined, waiting for the world to catch up to them. That is the strange quality of a long-running satirical show with the specific characteristics Family Guy has. Not every joke is a prediction. Most jokes are just jokes, and the vast majority of the thousands of cutaways that have aired since 1999 will never be connected to anything except the specific episode they appeared in. The law of large numbers cuts both ways. It explains some of the apparent predictions as statistical inevitability, and it also means that the overwhelming majority of the show's content is simply content. But somewhere in those thousands of hours, the cases we have discussed were sitting, invisible to most of the people who watched them, waiting, filed in plain sight, in the only form that would allow them to exist in public. Under the protection of comedy, under the cover of absurdity, in 3 to 15 seconds of apparent randomness that could be dismissed by anyone who needed to dismiss it. Some of those cases have now been found, examined, written about, and discussed by millions of people who never thought they were watching a document when they thought they were watching a cartoon. Some may still be waiting. The archive exists, it is searchable, it is replayable, it is permanently accessible in ways that earlier eras of television were not. And every time the world produces an event that rhymes with something already in those thousands of hours, someone will find it, clip it, post it, and a new generation of viewers will feel that specific electricity of recognition. It will not always be deserved. Some of those connections will be fabricated, like the Boston Marathon clip. Some will be loose thematic overlaps that require creative interpretation to hold together. Some will be genuine examples of the show's cultural intelligence finding its delayed confirmation. And a small number, like Stewie screaming about Kevin Spacey's basement in 2005, will be genuinely difficult to explain as anything other than the universe briefly making its editorial position visible through a cartoon. Part 26. The format was always the point. Let us spend some time on something that has been implicit in almost everything we have discussed but has not been stated directly yet. The format of Family Guy was not just a stylistic choice. It was a structural property of the show that made certain things possible that would have been impossible in any other format. And that structural property is directly connected to why the show generated so many apparent predictions, while other shows, equally long-running and equally full of cultural commentary, did not produce the same density of apparently prophetic moments. The cutaway gag creates discontinuity by design. The show explicitly states, every time a cutaway begins, that what follows is not connected to the ongoing story. It is a break, a digression. A moment where the normal rules of narrative continuity do not apply, and where nothing that appears can be held to the same standard of accountability as something that happens in the main plot. A character can be depicted in a cutaway doing something that would be impossible to depict in a continuous storyline, because the cutaway has already announced its own disconnection from reality. This disconnection is the protection. When Stewie screams about escaping from Kevin Spacey's basement, the scene has already identified itself as not serious. It is a cutaway. It is brief. It is the specific type of content that the audience has been trained across thousands of previous cutaways to treat as random and disposable. Nobody examines a cutaway the way they would examine a scene that appears in the main plot of an episode. The cutaway format carries an implicit instruction: do not look too closely. This is not meant to mean anything specific. What that instruction enabled, in the cases we have discussed, was the filing of specific information in a form that would not attract scrutiny. The Legal Standards Department could clear a 3-second gag about Kevin Spacey's basement as obviously fictional. No one could seriously argue that an animated baby running through a shopping mall and collecting money from a dog was a factual allegation against a real person. The format itself provided the defense, but the content was still there. In the archive, permanently accessible, waiting for the moment when the real-world events it described became public knowledge and someone went looking for connections. Every other format would have created different problems. A drama episode that depicted a character escaping from Kevin Spacey's captivity would have been immediately challenged. A documentary that repeated industry rumors about Spacey would have been legally actionable. A journalistic report that described what the writers had heard would have required attribution, verification, and the legal infrastructure to defend publication against a lawsuit from someone with considerable resources. The animated cutaway gag had none of those vulnerabilities. And that absence of vulnerability is what made it the specific form in which certain kinds of information survived in public. This is not the most comfortable way to think about what Family Guy was doing. It raises questions about responsibility, about the difference between filing information somewhere it is permanently accessible and actually doing something with it. It raises the question of what it means to know something and to encode it in comedy rather than trying to bring it to the people who needed to know it. Those are real questions, and they do not have clean answers. What can be said is that the format enabled the encoding. Whether the encoding served any genuine purpose beyond the creative act of making a dark joke is, in the final analysis, something that depends on what you think information is for and what you think comedy is capable of. Part 27. The Whisper Network in Historical Context. The informal knowledge systems we have been discussing, the Hollywood gossip networks through which information about powerful men's private behavior circulated for years before becoming publicly speakable, did not emerge from nothing. They have deep historical roots in the specific economics and social structures of the entertainment industry, and understanding those roots helps explain both why the information was trapped for so long and why it eventually found the exits it found. The entertainment industry has always been structured around asymmetric power relationships. Studios and production companies hold enormous leverage over the people who work for them, particularly at early and mid-career stages. An actor or writer or assistant who is trying to build a career in an industry where relationships and reputation are the primary currency of advancement is extraordinarily vulnerable to anyone who controls access to that currency. A powerful producer who can open or close doors with a phone call, a director whose projects attract A-list talent and whose word carries weight in every room, these are people who have structural protection against the normal mechanisms of accountability. That protection does not make misconduct invisible within the industry. It makes it invisible outside the industry. Within the circles where the behavior is occurring, people often know. They see it. They hear about it. They recognize patterns. They compare notes quietly with colleagues they trust. The knowledge accumulates in the informal networks through which all of the industry's actual social information moves. What it cannot do, under those conditions, is leave those networks. The person who experienced the misconduct fears professional retaliation. The witness who could corroborate the account fears the same. The journalist who has heard enough from enough people to believe something happened cannot publish without a source willing to be named, and no named source is available because no named source feels safe. The informal network contains the information, processes it, passes it around, and holds it in suspension, unable to convert it into anything that would produce change. This is the condition that the Me Too movement of 2017 and 2018 disrupted, not by introducing new information, but by changing the conditions under which existing information could be acted on. When enough people came forward simultaneously, when journalistic organizations committed to defending their sources, when the cultural environment shifted enough that the reputational risk of disclosure was outweighed by the potential consequences of continued silence, the information that had been held in suspension began to flow. It found journalists, it found courts, it found the general public. But before it found any of those things, some of it had found an animated show that was uniquely positioned to receive it and uniquely protected in how it expressed it. That is the specific historical niche that Family Guy occupied in relation to this information. Not as a whistleblower, not as an investigative outlet, not as a mechanism of accountability, but as a place where certain things that could not yet be said elsewhere had found a form in which they could survive. Part 28. The broader question of what cartoons see. Family Guy is not the only show in this conversation, even if it is the main subject of this video. It shares the territory of apparent prediction with several other long-running animated series, and some comparison is worth making because it helps clarify what is specific to Family Guy's situation and what is more generally true of animated comedy as a form. The Simpsons holds the title for most famous apparent predictions, including the Trump presidency, the Siegfried and Roy Tiger attack, faulty voting machines, video calling technology, smartwatches, and dozens of others. The Simpsons has been running since 1989, which gives it an even larger archive than Family Guy, and its writers have consistently been among the most culturally attentive working in American television. Many of its apparent predictions are the product of the same mechanism we have identified in Family Guy: sharp cultural analysis by writers who understood the direction of travel in American society well enough to describe where things were heading before they fully arrived. South Park has its own catalog of apparent predictions, many of them more recent and more politically specific, centered on the direction of American political culture and the specific pathologies of online discourse. South Park's approach to cultural analysis is more confrontational and more explicitly argumentative than Family Guy's, which means its apparent predictions tend to be about political dynamics and social movements rather than about individual people's private behavior. Futurama, the other animated series that often appears in these discussions, is a special case because its predictions were frequently about technology and because its writers were explicitly trying to imagine plausible futures rather than simply commenting on the present. Many of its apparent predictions about communication technology, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence were not so much predictions as extrapolations from existing scientific literature. What makes Family Guy specifically interesting in this company is the Hollywood insider dimension. The Simpsons predicts technology trends and political directions and cultural shifts. Family Guy predicts those things too, but it also has this specific and unusual track record of naming individual people in ways that turned out to be connected to things those people actually did. That is a different category of apparent prediction, and it reflects Family Guy's specific position in the landscape of American entertainment, a show made by people who were embedded in the very industry it was commenting on. The Simpsons writers are observing American culture largely from outside the specific power structures they are depicting. Family Guy's writers were, in many relevant cases, insider observers. They were in the rooms. They heard the things. They converted the things into jokes. The result was a type of apparent prediction that is qualitatively different from anything produced by a show whose writers are not embedded in the industry being observed. Part 29. Why some things look like prophecy from the inside. Here is the thing about the experience of watching these moments that most discussions of Family Guy's predictions do not fully account for. The experience is real, even when the mechanism is mundane. When you watch the Stewie clip from Don't Make Me Over and then read the 2017 Spacey allegations, something happens in your mind that does not fully dissolve when you understand that the mechanism behind it was industry gossip rather than psychic ability. The specific texture of the recognition, the cold electricity of seeing a piece of fiction accurately describe something that later turned out to be true, exists independently of knowing how the accuracy was produced. This is partly because human minds are not built to experience information as neutral. We experience information in context, and the context of a Family Guy joke that correctly described a real event creates a frame of meaning around that information that persists even after intellectual understanding of the mechanism kicks in. Knowing that the Spacey joke was probably based on industry rumors does not make it feel less eerie. It just gives the eeriness a different address. This is worth acknowledging because it explains why these cases continue to circulate, continue to be discussed, continue to generate new audience engagement even years after they first made headlines. The intellectual explanation for how a prediction happened does not replace the experiential reality of encountering it. Both can be true simultaneously. The mechanism is mundane, and the experience of the overlap is genuinely strange. It also explains something about why these moments matter culturally beyond their specific content. They are moments where the normally invisible gap between what is known informally and what is known publicly becomes briefly visible. The joke was in public. The thing it described was not yet in public. When the public knowledge catches up, the gap collapses, and the collapse is what produces the feeling we are all trying to describe with words like eeriness and strangeness and prediction. What we are actually feeling in those moments is the information gap closing, the private becoming public, the informal becoming formal, the whispered becoming confirmed. And that process, when it happens through the specific mechanism of a cartoon joke finding its confirmation years later, produces an experience for which our normal emotional and cognitive vocabulary is not quite adequate. So we reach for the word prediction, even when we know it is not quite right. Because it is the closest available shorthand for an experience that is more specific and more interesting than the word fully captures. Part 30. Family Guy as document, not oracle. Let us make the fundamental argument as clearly as possible, because it is the thing that everything we have covered tonight points toward. Family Guy is not an oracle. It is a document. An oracle makes statements about the future through some mysterious access to information that ordinary mortals do not have. An oracle's accuracy cannot be explained by reference to normal human knowledge and analysis. An oracle's predictions are, by definition, inexplicable. Family Guy's apparent predictions are, in their most compelling cases, entirely explicable. They were produced by specific mechanisms: inside information from informal networks, sharp cultural analysis by attentive observers, and occasionally by extraordinary coincidence. None of those mechanisms requires anything beyond normal human knowledge and experience. None of them is mysterious. What makes the show interesting is not that it was inexplicably accurate. It is that it was a particular kind of document of its moment, recording things that its writers knew or suspected or observed about the world they were embedded in the only form available to them. And because that form was permanent, searchable, and publicly accessible in a way that informal knowledge networks are not, the record it created can be reviewed after the fact. A document records, it files information. It creates a permanent record of what was known at a specific moment in time. What Family Guy's best apparent predictions record is not the future. They record the present, specifically the present as it was understood by a specific group of people in a specific position within the entertainment industry in the early years of the 21st century. Some of what that present contained was information about powerful people's private behavior that would not become publicly known for another decade or more. Some of it was analysis of cultural trends that would play out over the following years. Some of it was ordinary cultural observation that happened to remain relevant. The record exists. The archive is searchable. and some of what is in that archive looks, from the outside, like prophecy. But what it actually looks like, when you examine it closely, is evidence. Evidence of what was known, evidence of where it was held, evidence of the conditions that kept it trapped in informal channels rather than reaching the people who needed it most. Evidence of the specific social and professional structures that protected powerful people from accountability by ensuring that the information about their behavior could circulate widely in some environments and not at all in others. Evidence that a cartoon was sometimes a better map of certain things than almost anything else that was publicly available at the time. Part 31. The cases still in the archive. Everything we have covered tonight is retrospective. We are looking at things that have already happened, examining overlaps that are already documented, explaining mechanisms that are already partially understood. But the show is still running. Family Guy has been renewed through season 27 to the 2028 to 2029 television season. New episodes are being written right now. New cutaways are being pitched in a writer's room that is still staffed by people who are embedded in the entertainment industry, still hearing things through informal channels, still converting the world into comedy. Some of those jokes will turn out to have described something real. We cannot know which ones in advance. That is the nature of the situation. The information is present in the content before anyone can identify it as information rather than as comedy. It only becomes identifiable in retrospect when the real event it describes finally becomes public. The cases still in the archive, the ones that have not yet found their referent, are invisible by definition. They are sitting in plain sight, in episodes that most people have watched and forgotten, filed under comedy rather than under intelligence. Some will never find their referent, because they are just jokes, and most jokes are just jokes. But some will, because the mechanisms that produce the confirmed cases are still operating. New writers are in that room. New industry gossip is circulating through the networks those writers are embedded in. New cultural trends are developing that careful observers can extrapolate from. New coincidences are waiting to be generated by a universe that is indifferent to the significance of its timing. The archive will grow, and some of what is added will look, eventually, like something more than comedy. Part 32. Why this matters beyond the show itself. Let us close with something that goes beyond Family Guy specifically, because the phenomenon we have been discussing tells us something that is worth thinking about even after the show is done. Most of us navigate the world with access to the official public record. What has been reported? What has been confirmed? What has been verified to journalistic or institutional standards? The official record is important. It is the foundation of shared public knowledge. But it is always incomplete, because the conditions required to move information from informal channels into the official record are demanding, slow, and unevenly distributed. Some people in some positions have access to information that never makes it into the official record, or makes it there only after enormous delays. The informal knowledge networks of specific industries, professions, and communities contain things that the broader public does not have access to, not because those things are being actively concealed from the public, but because the mechanisms that would move them from informal to formal are blocked or absent. When those mechanisms finally work, when information that was held informally finally becomes public, we experience it as revelation, as breaking news, as things finally coming to light. What the Family Guy case shows is that some of those things were already partly visible. If you knew where to look, they were in the archive, in coded form. In a form that most of the audience was not equipped to read. This is not a comforting observation. It suggests that what we know publicly about the world is always a fraction of what is known informally by people who are positioned to receive certain kinds of information. It suggests that the gap between what is known and what can be said is large, persistent, and consequential. It suggests that some of the things we will be shocked to learn in the future are things that some people already know today, in informal channels, in whispered conversations, in the kind of encoded comedy that has always been where truth goes when it has nowhere else to go. That is the real lesson of the Family Guy prediction phenomenon. Not that a cartoon saw the future, but that some of the people who made it could already see a present that the rest of us had not been given access to yet. And they filed what they saw in the only place it could survive. In 3 to 15 seconds of apparently random animated comedy, in the archive, in plain sight, waiting. Part 33. the cases you already know, and the ones you might have missed. Let us do a final pass through the full catalog, because after all this ground, it helps to have every entry named clearly in one place, the Kevin Spacey case. Season 4, Episode 4, Don't Make Me Over, 2005. Stewie screams about escaping from Kevin Spacey's basement. Spacey's sexual misconduct allegations became public in October 2017, 12 years. The show's own team confirmed the mechanism. Industry rumors converted into jokes that could pass standards. The strongest case on the list. The Brett Ratner case. Season 10, Episode 20, Lego My Mego, 2012. Stewie goes undercover at a trafficking auction where Brett Ratner is a bidder. Ratner's harassment and assault allegations became public in November 2017. 5 years. Same mechanism as the Spacey case? The Harvey Weinstein adjacent case. Not a Family Guy episode, but MacFarlane at the 2013 Oscars. He told the 5 Best Supporting Actress nominees they no longer had to pretend to be attracted to Weinstein. He explained afterward that he had personal reasons to despise the man. The Weinstein allegations became public in October 2017. 4 years between the Oscars joke and the public story. The Caitlyn Jenner case. Season 7, Episode 17, We Love You, Conrad, 2009. Stewie states that Bruce Jenner is a woman. The show returned to the same territory in Season 10's Lottery Fever in 2011. Jenner's public announcement and Vanity Fair cover, 2015. 6 years from the first joke. The BBC 3 broadcast timing. Season 10, Episode 22, Viewer Mail Number 2, 2012. The Fatman and Robin segment, in which Peter makes multiple attempts on his own life while surrounded by an overwhelming presence of Robin Williams' image. BBC 3 aired the episode as a repeat on the 11th of August 2014. The news of Williams' passing broke approximately as the episode was ending. 2 years between the US broadcast and the BBC timing. Pure coincidence. The Boston Marathon. Season 11, Episode 16, Turban Cowboy, the 17th of March, 2013. Contains a cutaway of Peter driving through Boston Marathon runners and a separate plot involving terrorism. The Boston Marathon attack occurred the 15th of April, 2013, 29 days later. A fabricated edited clip falsely suggested a direct connection. The original episode does not depict a bombing at the marathon. The viral claim was a hoax built on a real topical overlap. The COVID-19 vaccination episode. Season 15, Episode 6, Hot Shots, November 2016, depicts the cycle of anti-vaccination sentiment, community outbreak, and quarantine. COVID-19 pandemic began spreading globally, late 2019. 4 years between the episode and the pandemic. The cannabis legalization case. Season 7, Episode 12, 420, April 2009. Brian campaigns to legalize marijuana in the show's New England setting. Rhode Island legalized recreational cannabis in May 2022. 13 years. The Antonin Scalia case. Season 5, Episode 18, Meet the Quagmires, May 2007. An alternate timeline includes Dick Cheney killing Scalia while hunting. Scalia died in February 2016 at a Texas hunting resort of natural causes. 9 years. Loose overlap. The specific story did not come true. The Paul Walker case. Season 12, Episode 6, Life of Brian, the 24th of November 2013. Brian Griffin dies in a car accident. Paul Walker, who played a character named Brian O'Connor in the Fast and Furious franchise, died in a car accident on the 30th of November, 2013, 6 days apart. Pure coincidence. The Barry Manilow case. Season 6, Episode 9, Back to the Woods, February 2008. Manilow serenades Quagmire with a love song. Manilow came out as gay in April 2017, 9 years. The Charlie Rose case. Cutaway in The New Adventures of Old Tom. Peter compares Tom Tucker's fall from grace to Charlie Rose and implies Rose has a disqualifying private behavior. Rose's sexual harassment allegations became public in November 2017. The Ellen DeGeneres case. Cutaway in And I'm Joyce Kinney. Ellen talks over guests and makes them uncomfortable, suggesting a gap between public warmth and private interpersonal reality. DeGeneres show workplace misconduct allegations, 2020. The Iceman Comics case, Season 5, Hell Comes to Town, 2006. Cutaway showing Iceman sneaking into a gay bar. Marvel Comics confirmed Bobby Drake as gay in all-new X-Men issue 40, 2015. 9 years. The Will Smith Oscars case. Season 3, Episode 8, Stuck Together, Torn Apart. January 2002. Cutaway of Peter charging a stage and punching a performer because the performer directed attention toward Lois. Will Smith struck Chris Rock at the 2022 Oscars. 20 years between the episode and the event. The Bitcoin case, Season 14, 2015. Peter mentions Bitcoin as a financial strategy. Bitcoin's mainstream ascent, 2017 onward. The UK Internet censorship case. Cutaway parodying British adult entertainment as extremely inhibited. UK Digital Economy Act provisions for adult website age verification, 2017. The Rhode Island cannabis case from the same episode as Brian's campaign. Brian campaigns in the show's fictional New England setting. Rhode Island, the real state where the show is set, legalized recreational cannabis in 2022. That is the full catalog. Some entries are genuinely compelling. Some require careful qualification. All of them are documented and all of them have generated real public discussion. The exercise of listing them together, with their time spans and their mechanisms, gives you a clear picture of what the phenomenon actually looks like in totality, not a uniform record of eerie accuracy. A mixed record with a handful of genuinely striking cases, a larger number of moderately interesting cases, and a long tail of looser overlaps that require generous interpretation to sustain. The handful of genuinely striking cases are striking enough to make the whole list worth examining. The Kevin Spacey case alone, with its specific language and its 12-year gap, would be enough to warrant everything we have covered tonight. Part 34. The show continues and so does the archive. Family Guy is currently in production on what will eventually be its 26th and 27th seasons, locked in through the 2028 to 2029 television season under the deal with Disney. Announced in April 2025. 15 episodes per season. New episodes airing on a schedule that has drifted from the primetime Sunday night position the show held for most of its history to its current Wednesday night placement, a move widely understood in the television industry as a demotion. The show's viewership in its most recent seasons has declined to a fraction of what it was at its commercial peak. Season 23 averaged around 723,000 viewers, down from the approximately 7,900,000 who watched the Season 4 premiere in 2005. The audience has contracted by roughly 90% over 20 years. The show continues anyway, because the economics of animated content in the era of streaming and syndication make first-run viewership only one component of the financial picture. New writers are working in the room. Some of them have been there for many years. Some are newer arrivals. They are attending industry events, talking to colleagues, hearing things through informal channels, converting the world into comedy at the standard pace of television production. Some of what they hear and observe and imagine will eventually find its way into cutaway gags that air between now and 2029. Some of those gags will describe the world accurately in ways that most viewers will not recognize at the time. Some will describe things that will only become publicly visible years after the episode airs. Some will be pure coincidence waiting for its event. And the vast majority will simply be jokes, exactly what they appear to be, nothing more. The archive will continue to grow. The catalog of apparent predictions will continue to expand, and someone in some future year will be watching an episode that aired in 2026 or 2027 and will feel that specific electricity of a world briefly folding in on itself, of a cartoon briefly becoming a document, of 3 to 15 seconds of apparently random comedy briefly becoming something else. The mechanisms that produced every case we discussed tonight are still operating. They have always been operating. They will keep operating as long as the show is being made by people who are embedded in the industry it is commenting on, as long as the informal information networks of entertainment are producing knowledge that cannot yet reach formal channels, and as long as the cutaway format continues to provide a container that can hold specific content without attracting the scrutiny that content would attract in any other form, the show continues. And so does the archive. Part 35. one last look at what it all means. We have been at this for a long time tonight, and I want to close by saying one more thing about why this material matters beyond the specific cases. The Family Guy prediction phenomenon is often discussed as though it is primarily about the show, about Seth MacFarlane, about the specific jokes and their specific apparent targets, about the eerie experience of watching a cartoon describe something that later turned out to be real. But what it is actually about is the gap. The gap between what is known informally and what is known publicly. The gap between what circulates in certain circles and what the broader world has access to. The gap between things that are understood by people with specific kinds of insider access and things that can be confirmed, published, and acted upon by the people who need to know them. That gap is not specific to the entertainment industry. It exists in every industry, every institution, every community where information is unevenly distributed and where the conditions required to move information from informal to formal are demanding and unevenly available. It exists in corporate environments, in political institutions, in academic settings, in every place where power relationships create incentives for some people to hold information and disincentives for others to surface it. Family Guy happened to create a specific kind of accidental record of that gap in relation to the Hollywood entertainment industry in the early years of the 21st century. But the gap it recorded is universal. The mechanisms it accidentally documented are not specific to that industry or that period. They are the ongoing normal condition of human social organization, in which what is known and what can be said have never been the same thing and will never be the same thing. What the show did, in its most interesting apparent predictions, was provide a brief, temporary, partial bridge across that gap. Not a sufficient bridge, not a bridge that helped anyone who needed help, but a bridge made of comedy, permanent in the archive, publicly accessible to anyone who could read it, waiting for the moment when the gap closed from the other direction. The gaps are still there. They are always there. And somewhere in them, right now, is information that will eventually become public, and that some pieces of fiction are probably already carrying in coded form, waiting for the world to catch up. That is what the Family Guy predictions are actually about. Not a cartoon that saw the future. A cartoon that occasionally described a present that most of us were not yet allowed to see. And that is, when you really sit with it, a genuinely extraordinary thing for a 30-minute animated comedy to have accomplished, even accidentally, even imperfectly, even in 3 to 15 seconds of apparently random comedy that most people watched and immediately forgot. The world was already in the cartoon. It just had not finished happening yet. Closing? If you made it all the way through this one, genuinely, thank you. These long ones take time, and the fact that you stayed through all of it means something. If you found value in what we covered tonight, if any of it surprised you or gave you something to think about or just kept you company through the hours, please consider subscribing if you have not already. It is free. It tells the channel that this kind of work is reaching people who appreciate it, and it means future videos like this one find the audience they are looking for. Leave a like on the video as well if you are willing. It helps the algorithm understand that something worth watching is here, and that matters more than it probably should in the current media landscape. But here we are. And drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you watched from tonight, what time it was, what brought you here. Tell me if there is a case we missed, a prediction you think deserves its own full examination, a direction you want to see this channel go. I read every comment and I take them seriously. The archive of this show is enormous, and we have barely touched its edges tonight. There is always more to find. Until the next one. Take care of yourselves out there. Extended analysis. The Me Too predictions in full, a deeper look at each case. We moved through the Spacey and Ratner cases relatively quickly in the main body of this video. Let us spend more time with them now, because they deserve the additional depth. These are the two cases that represent Family Guy's apparent predictions at their most specific, their most documentable, and their most difficult to explain as simple chance. Getting into the full texture of how they worked, what was said about them afterward, and what they actually tell us matters for anyone who wants to engage with this phenomenon seriously. The Spacey case begins with a single 3-second gag in a 2005 episode and ends with a 12-year gap that closes all at once in October 2017. But what happened in those 12 years is worth understanding in detail because the gap was not empty. During those years, Kevin Spacey continued building one of the most respected careers in Hollywood. House of Cards launched on Netflix in 2013 and made him one of the faces of the prestige streaming era. He won a Golden Globe for his performance as Francis Underwood. He was producing films, receiving Lifetime Achievement recognition, and operating at the absolute center of the industry's most powerful circles. He was also, according to the accounts that emerged in 2017 and afterward, continuing the patterns of behavior that the Family Guy joke had apparently alluded to in 2005. The Old Vic Theatre in London, where he was artistic director from 2004 to 2015, became one of the primary sites of documented complaints. Employees there described a pattern of behavior over many years. His time on House of Cards generated its own wave of accounts from people who had worked on set. A production assistant came forward with a particularly serious allegation. The accounts spanned 2 decades of continuing conduct. And across those 2 decades, the Family Guy joke was sitting in the archive, in the permanent accessible record, having been watched by millions of people, and apparently registered by most of them as nothing more than a strange 3-second gag. When the Spacey story broke, several things happened simultaneously. The archive was searched. The clip was found. Alex Sulkin gave the Hollywood Reporter interview that provided the closest thing to an official explanation available. The writers had heard things, had converted them into jokes, had relied on the format to make the jokes defensible even if accurate. What the Sulkin explanation does not fully address is the ethical dimension of that process. If the writer's room had heard things that turned out to be accurate, things that described real behavior being perpetrated against real people, the decision to convert that information into a 3-second gag rather than doing anything more direct with it was a choice. A choice made under real constraints, to be fair. The informal information that circulates in Hollywood does not arrive with names attached and affidavits supporting it. It arrives as rumor, as "I heard that," as the kind of account that no journalist could publish and no legal system could act on. The writers were not in a position to go public with what they knew because what they knew did not constitute evidence in any formal sense. But the choice to make it into comedy rather than to try to find a path toward the people who needed to know it is still worth sitting with. Because the joke did not help anyone, it did not make it easier for the people who eventually came forward to do so. It did not create conditions for accountability. It filed the information somewhere and moved on. And the people it described continued behaving in the ways the joke had alluded to for another 12 years. That is not a condemnation of the writers or of the show. It is an honest accounting of what the jokes accomplished and what they did not accomplish. They preserved information in a public form. They did not convert information into action. The Brett Ratner case has a slightly different texture. The specific nature of that joke, depicting Ratner bidding at a trafficking auction for an underage girl, carries a more extreme implication than the Spacey basement gag. The Spacey joke implies captivity and escape. The Ratner joke implies active participation in the exploitation of a minor as a purchaser. These are different levels of specificity about different types of behavior. What made it through the standards and practices process, in both cases, was the absurdity of the animated context. A cartoon baby escaping from a real person's basement. A cartoon baby dressed as a girl being auctioned in a Taken parody to a real person. In both cases, the explicit fictional frame and the specific conventions of the animated cutaway format provided the protection that allowed specific names to be attached to specific implications, without triggering the legal response that would have followed any more direct statement. When the Ratner allegations became public in November 2017, the same dynamics that accompanied the Spacey revelation played out again. The archive was searched. The clip was found. The specific nature of the joke, its precision about the type of behavior being implied, generated a different quality of response than the Spacey clip had. People who encountered the Ratner clip described it as more unsettling, because the scenario depicted was more extreme, and the gap between comedy and reality was correspondingly smaller. Together, the Spacey and Ratner cases form the strongest possible evidence for the Whisper Network mechanism in Family Guy's apparent predictions. Both named, both specific, both confirmed by the show's own creative team to have been grounded in industry information, even if that information was unverified rumor rather than confirmed fact. Both aired years before the public allegations, both occupying the same tier of the prediction catalog. They also together point to something about the specific environment of Hollywood in the 2000s and early 2010s. The informal knowledge networks were carrying information about multiple powerful men simultaneously. The information was moving through those networks continuously, being shared in private conversations that would never be documented, being understood by people who could not act on what they understood. The Family Guy jokes about Spacey and Ratner were not unique events in a quiet landscape. They were two visible moments in a landscape full of similar conversations that never found a visible form. Extended analysis. The vaccination episode, Why Cultural Extrapolation is Its Own Form of Foresight. The Hot Shots episode deserves more attention than we gave it in the main body, because it represents a genuinely different category of apparent foresight from the inside information cases, and one that is, in some ways, more impressive. Inside information is a relatively simple mechanism once you understand it. Someone knows something, they cannot say it directly, they say it through comedy. The comedy looks prescient in retrospect because the information it contained was accurate. The impressive thing is the information itself and the conditions that prevented it from being said more directly. Cultural extrapolation is more complex. It requires understanding not just a single piece of information about a single person or event, but the direction of travel of an entire social system. It requires seeing not just what is happening now, but what the current dynamics will inevitably produce if they continue on their existing trajectory. And it requires being willing to dramatize that endpoint in a way that is clear enough to be recognizable when the endpoint arrives. The writers who made Hot Shots in 2016 were not predicting COVID-19. They were looking at the anti-vaccination movement as it existed in 2016 and asking, what happens if this continues? What does the endpoint of this trend look like? And then they dramatized that endpoint in the specific comedic register available to them. The anti-vaccination movement in 2016 was already a well-documented public health concern. The Wakefield study had been retracted in 2010. The scientific consensus on vaccine safety was overwhelming, but the movement had been growing for years, had already produced measles outbreaks in California and elsewhere, and was showing no signs of slowing. Public health officials were already warning about the consequences of falling vaccination rates. The information required to write Hot Shots was entirely public and entirely available to anyone who was reading it. What the writers did was connect that information to a comedic endpoint. They followed the logic of the existing trend to its natural conclusion. Hesitancy spreads, vaccination rates fall below herd immunity threshold, an outbreak occurs, the town goes into quarantine. The person who finally wants to do the right thing finds that earlier choices have already made it too late. That is not prophecy. That is public health modeling, compressed into 22 minutes of comedy. What made it remarkable was the specificity of the fit when COVID-19 arrived. The pandemic, while a different disease in a different context, triggered the same basic social dynamics that Hot Shots had depicted, the same online information spirals. The same rapid spread of hesitancy through communities, the same quarantines and lockdowns, the same too late realizations by people who had initially declined vaccination, the same fundamental problem that individual decisions about vaccination aggregate into community-level outcomes that cannot be reversed by individuals who change their minds after the damage is done. The writers had depicted the shape of the failure mode. They had not depicted a specific pathogen or a specific pandemic. But the shape was accurate enough that viewers watching the episode during the COVID-19 pandemic recognized it immediately. That recognition is what generated the wave of social media discussion about Hot Shots in 2020 and 2021. It is also worth noting what the show did with the recognition once the pandemic was real. The 2021 PSA, produced in partnership with the Ad Council to encourage COVID-19 vaccination, used the same characters to make the same argument that Hot Shots had made 5 years earlier, but now in relation to a specific real disease, rather than a hypothetical satirical scenario. The show had depicted the problem. It was then enlisted to help address the problem. That is a coherent arc for a piece of cultural satire to follow. The vaccination case also illustrates something about the specific value of long-running television as a cultural form. Because the episode existed, because it was in the archive and searchable and available, The resonance it had with the real pandemic was able to circulate through social media and find an audience that might not have watched it in 2016. The timing of the episode's second wave of circulation, in 2020 when it was most relevant, was not planned. But the permanence of the archive made it possible. Hot Shots was available to be rediscovered at exactly the moment when its subject matter had become urgently relevant to everyone on Earth. Extended analysis. The BBC Three broadcast sitting with pure coincidence. Let us spend more time with the Robin Williams case as well, because it is genuinely the most unusual entry on this entire list and it deserves more space than we have given it. The BBC Three timing is different from every other case in a fundamental way. There is no mechanism behind it. There is nothing to explain. The episode aired in 2012 in the United States. It was scheduled as a UK repeat more than 2 weeks in advance of the 11th of August 2014. Robin Williams died on the 11th of August 2014. The episode ended approximately as the news broke. What makes this case interesting to sit with is precisely the absence of mechanism. Every other compelling case on this list has an explanation, even if the explanation is mundane. Inside information, cultural analysis, statistical inevitability. The BBC Three timing has none of those. It is simply what it is. An extraordinary coincidence of timing involving a specific episode about a specific person on the specific night that person died. The human response to this kind of coincidence is worth examining on its own terms, because the response tells us something about how we process chance events when they carry emotional weight. The immediate response to the BBC Three timing, when it became widely known, was a kind of collective silence. Not the excitement that sometimes accompanies apparent predictions. Not the dark amusement that accompanied, say, the Stewie clip about Kevin Spacey when it resurfaced in 2017. A different kind of feeling. Something quieter and harder to name. Part of what made it quieter was who Robin Williams was. Unlike the Spacey or Ratner cases, which involved powerful men whose private conduct was being alluded to critically, the Robin Williams situation involved someone who was deeply and genuinely beloved. The response to his death was one of collective grief, worldwide and immediate. People who had grown up with his comedy, his films, his specific quality of overwhelming, generous, slightly manic presence felt the loss personally in a way that is unusual for the death of a celebrity they had never met. The Fat Man and Robin episode was, in some sense, about what it would feel like to be Robin Williams. Or at least about what it would feel like to be so overwhelmed by something that the only desire is to make it stop. The specific emotional territory of the episode was not accidentally adjacent to the circumstances of Williams's death. It was describing something about the experience of being surrounded by a force that cannot be turned off, a presence that fills every available space, a joy that has become indistinguishable from a demand. Whether the writers intended any of that reading, and they almost certainly did not, the BBC Three timing gave it weight. An episode that had been a piece of dark comedy in 2012 became, on one specific night in 2014, something else. Not a prediction, something more like an elegy that arrived before the occasion for it. The BBC spokesperson's comment is worth returning to. The episode ended just as the news broke about his death. This was a repeat that we have shown a couple of times before, so who could have planned that? It was scheduled more than 2 weeks ago, so it is just an uncanny coincidence. The phrase uncanny coincidence does a lot of work in that sentence. Uncanny is the right word. It means strange, mysterious, beyond what seems naturally possible. The technical explanation is that it was chance, pure and simple. The subjective experience of it was something else. The gap between the technical explanation and the subjective experience is the space in which the word uncanny lives. We encounter uncanny coincidences throughout our lives, but usually they are small. Finding that you were thinking of someone just before they called, hearing a song that exactly fits the mood of a moment, the coincidences that feel meaningful but leave no lasting mark. The BBC Three timing was an uncanny coincidence at scale, witnessed by a large number of people simultaneously, involving a person of significant cultural importance, and it left something behind that smaller coincidences do not. It left the episode in a different relationship with its subject. Family Guy had made an episode about Robin Williams in 2012. In 2014, on the night he died, the episode was playing in the United Kingdom as if the universe had scheduled it. The episode existed before the event. The event gave the episode a meaning it had not previously had, and that relationship, episode to event, remains in place in the archive, permanent and unchangeable. People who watch Fatman and Robin now know what happened on the night it last aired in the UK. They cannot unknow it. The episode is not the same piece of television it was in May 2012. It has been marked by what happened in August 2014, the way a piece of music becomes permanently associated with a moment you heard it during, unable to be entirely separated from the emotional context that was attached to it in the most significant listening. That is what the BBC Three timing did. It did not predict anything. It created an association, and that association is now part of what the episode is. Extended analysis. What comes next in the archive? The show continues. Let us think about what that means in concrete terms for the apparent prediction phenomenon we have been discussing. Family Guy's apparent predictions have, as we have established, come from three distinct sources: inside information from informal networks, cultural extrapolation from clear-eyed observation of social trends, and pure coincidence. All three sources are still operational. The informal information networks of Hollywood are still producing knowledge that cannot yet reach formal channels. The Me Too movement of 2017 and 2018 created significant change in the conditions under which certain kinds of information could become public, but it did not eliminate the basic dynamic. There are almost certainly powerful people whose private conduct is known informally in certain circles today but cannot yet reach the formal record. Some of that knowledge is probably present in the Family Guy writers' room right now, in the form of industry conversations and industry gossip that has not yet found its public form. When it does find its public form, whether in 1 year or 10 years, people will search the archive, they will find the relevant Family Guy cutaways. They will have the same experience that millions of people had when the Spacey and Ratner allegations broke and the relevant clips were found. The archive is already populated with the future's revelations. We simply do not know which jokes those are yet. The cultural analysis dimension is also ongoing. The directions that American society is currently traveling, the trajectories that careful observers can see clearly today, are being dramatized in Family Guy episodes being written and aired right now. Some of those dramatizations will hold up. Some will be accurate enough in their general shape that future events will seem to rhyme with them. The writers are still reading the world, still extracting its tendencies, still converting cultural analysis into comedy. Some of it will land with the same quality of recognition that Hot Shots did. And the coincidences are simply the universe doing what it always does. There will be more of them. There always are. The specific one that arrives next, if it arrives with enough emotional weight and specific enough detail, will generate the same experience that the Paul Walker case and the BBC Three timing generated. We cannot predict it. We can only notice it after it has already happened. This is the perpetual condition of having a 25-plus-year archive of specific cultural commentary available in a permanently searchable form. The archive is always ahead of us. It contains more than we have yet found in it. And the world, continuing to produce events, will continue to find things in it that resemble what it has produced. Some of those resemblances will be the product of genuine foreknowledge, encoded in comedy. Some will be the product of accurate analysis finding its delayed confirmation. Some will be the universe briefly rhyming. And many, perhaps most, will be the product of pattern-seeking minds applying meaning to coincidences that deserve none. The work, and it is genuinely interesting work, is in distinguishing between those categories. That is what we have tried to do tonight. Not to say that all of Family Guy's apparent predictions are equally significant, because they are not. Not to say that the show was never genuinely describing real things in its best cases, because it clearly was, but to build a framework for thinking about each case on its own terms, with the appropriate level of evidence required for each type of claim. The most striking cases are real and documented, and genuinely difficult to explain as simple chance. The weaker cases require qualification and intellectual honesty. And the whole phenomenon, taken together, points towards something that matters beyond any individual case. The idea that entertainment, even animated comedy built around disconnected gags and impulsive characters, can be a document of its moment in ways that are more substantive and more consequential than it first appears. Family Guy was always more than it looked like. The apparent predictions are part of the evidence for that claim. Not the only part, and not even the most important part, but a part that is publicly accessible, permanently archived, and still generating new recognitions every time the world produces an event that the show had already, in some form, described. The archive is there, the world is still catching up to parts of it, and the show is still making new entries. Final reflection: everything the cartoon already knew. Let us come back to the beginning for a moment, because where we started and where we have ended up are genuinely far apart, and the distance is worth acknowledging. We started with the question of whether a long-running animated comedy had a pattern of apparently foreseeing real events. That is a question that sounds, when you first encounter it, like entertainment trivia, a fun list, a collection of eerie coincidences to watch before you fall asleep. Where we ended up is somewhere considerably more interesting than that. We ended up looking at a specific mechanism by which information that cannot travel through formal channels sometimes finds an informal exit through comedy. We ended up examining the specific structural properties of the cutaway gag format that made certain kinds of content survivable in ways they would not have been in other formats. We ended up thinking about the relationship between inside information and public knowledge, and about what it means for some people to know things that others cannot yet access. We ended up with the BBC Three timing, which has nothing to do with any of those mechanisms, and everything to do with the universe's complete indifference to what would be convenient for our understanding. All of that emerged from asking, seriously, why a cartoon kept turning out to have already described things that the world later confirmed. The answer is not that it was psychic. The answer is that it was a specific kind of document, produced by people in a specific position within a specific industry, using a specific format that had specific protective properties across a specific and extraordinarily long period of time. All of those specifics combine to produce something that looks, from the outside, like a show that occasionally saw the future. What it actually saw was the present. The present as it was understood by the people who made it. The present that existed in informal channels before it existed in the public record. The present that was being enacted by powerful people in spaces that most of the audience had no access to. The present that was heading in directions that careful observers could trace out, but that most people had not yet followed to their conclusions. The cartoon already knew some things. It filed them in plain sight, and the world eventually caught up. That is the real story of every Family Guy prediction that came true. Not magic, not coincidence in most of the most striking cases, something more interesting than either. A document, written in comedy, containing things that the culture needed to process but could not yet process directly. A record of what some people knew and what the rest of us would eventually learn. It was always there. It was always accessible. Most of us just watched it as a cartoon, which is what it looked like, which is exactly what it wanted to look like, until it stopped being possible to look at it that way. And that is where we leave it tonight. Every case, every mechanism, every overlap between a cartoon and a world that the cartoon had already, in its own way, described. Wherever you are watching from, whatever time it is there, thank you for spending this time here. Drop that location and time in the comments. I read everything. Subscribe if you have not already. There is much more where this came from. Until the next one. Supplemental. The full history of the Writers' Room and its information networks. We have talked about the Hollywood Whisper Network as an abstract concept. Let us get more specific about what that actually looked like in practice during the specific period when Family Guy was producing its most striking apparent predictions. The show's creative staff during its golden era in the mid-2000s and early 2010s operated within a very specific professional ecosystem. The entertainment industry's social infrastructure in Los Angeles is famously dense. Writers who worked on Family Guy also worked on other shows, attended the same industry events, socialized with the same people at the same places, and were plugged into guild activities that put them in contact with writers from across every genre and format working in American television and film. The Writers Guild of America West is not merely a labor organization, it is a social institution. Its events, screenings, panels, and committee work bring together working writers from across the industry in settings where professional and personal conversation overlaps freely. The information economy of the Writers' Room begins there and extends outward into every bar, restaurant, party, and informal gathering where people who make their living through storytelling congregate. In that economy, information about powerful people's behavior has always moved with extraordinary speed. The industry has never been large enough for secrets to stay entirely contained. A director who behaves badly on a set will have that information spread through the community within weeks, not months. A producer who exploits a position of power will have that behavior known in certain circles long before any formal complaint is filed. The mechanism is not organized. It is not a conspiracy. It is simply what happens when a large number of people with overlapping professional and personal networks talk to each other. What makes this relevant to Family Guy specifically is the show's particular position in that ecosystem. Family Guy was produced at Fox's 20th Century Fox Television Studios in Los Angeles. The show operated within a production ecosystem that included dozens of writers, producers, directors, animators, and support staff, all of whom had their own connections to the broader industry. The writers' room itself, at its most productive, was staffed by people who had worked across the industry, who had relationships with people in film as well as television, and who were actively embedded in the social life of the entertainment industry in a way that a more isolated production would not be. Seth MacFarlane's own personal network was and is extensive. He has been a prominent figure in the entertainment industry since the mid-1990s and has developed relationships across every tier of the business. The people he knew, the rooms he was in, the conversations he was part of across decades of working in Los Angeles represent exactly the kind of access to informal information that explains the most specific apparent predictions the show produced. When MacFarlane says that the Family Guy writers have always had very open ears, he is describing a show that was structurally positioned to receive the informal information that circulates through the entertainment industry's social infrastructure. Open ears in a world where information moves through informal networks means exactly what it sounds like: a predisposition to absorb what is being said in the rooms you move through. Some of what was being said in those rooms in the mid-2000s and early 2010s was information about Kevin Spacey, Brett Ratner, Harvey Weinstein, Barry Manilow, Charlie Rose, and the others whose apparent Family Guy predictions we have been examining. That information was present. It was in the air. It was being passed from person to person in the specific form that informal information takes in that world. Not as documented allegation, not as confirmed fact, but as the kind of thing that everyone in certain circles had heard, and that everyone in those circles had no formal way to act on. The Family Guy writers' room absorbed some of that information and converted it into comedy. Not all of it, and not all of the most important pieces, but enough that the archive of the show contained specific jokes that turned out to describe things that were later publicly confirmed. Understanding this fully explains why the most striking apparent predictions are not evenly distributed across the show's run. They cluster in the period when the writers' room was most fully engaged, most socially connected, and most actively processing the world around it. The show's later seasons, produced by a somewhat different configuration of writers in a somewhat different industry context, have not generated the same density of striking apparent predictions. The archive reflects the specific conditions of the specific period when it was most alive. Supplemental: the neuroscience of pattern recognition and why these moments feel the way they do. We have spent a lot of time examining the mechanisms behind the apparent predictions. Let us spend a little time on the mechanism behind our experience of them, because understanding why these moments feel the way they feel adds something important to the overall picture. Human beings are pattern recognition machines. We are better at finding patterns than almost any other cognitive task we perform, and we find patterns everywhere, including in random data. This capacity served our ancestors well in environments where finding patterns in sensory information, the rustle that might be a predator, the sequence of events that preceded a storm, was directly connected to survival. The cost of false positives in that environment was low. The cost of false negatives was potentially fatal. So evolution optimized us to find patterns aggressively, even where none exist. This means that when we encounter a piece of fiction that appears to have accurately described a real event, our minds respond with a specific cognitive and emotional experience that is independent of the actual causal mechanism. We feel the pattern lock in. We experience the recognition. We assign meaning to the correspondence. All of this happens before and largely independently of our intellectual assessment of what actually caused the overlap. The experience of watching a Family Guy clip about Kevin Spacey's basement and then reading the 2017 allegations produces a distinctive feeling. It is not quite surprise, because you are not discovering something new in the Spacey story. It is not quite horror, because the clip is a cartoon. It is a specific kind of vertigo, a sensation of time collapsing, of fiction and reality briefly occupying the same space in a way that should be impossible. That feeling is real even though the mechanism behind it is mundane. This is not a contradiction. The experience of pattern recognition is always real, regardless of whether the pattern being recognized reflects genuine structural order or coincidence. Our minds were not designed to distinguish between them automatically. They were designed to notice and respond to apparent patterns and to flag them as significant. The cultural persistence of the apparent predictions phenomenon, the fact that it continues to generate attention and discussion years after the most significant revelations occurred, is partly explained by this neuroscience. Every new person who encounters the Kevin Spacey clip for the first time has the same vertiginous experience that millions of people had in 2017. The experience is reproducible. It is not diminished by being explained. Understanding that the mechanism was likely industry gossip rather than precognition does not make the pattern recognition response go away. It just adds intellectual context around an experience that remains emotionally potent. This is why the apparent predictions continue to circulate. They produce a reliable and distinctive experience in anyone who encounters them without prior knowledge. The Stewie clip, the Caitlyn Jenner scene, the cannabis episode, the vaccination episode, these are all pieces of content that produce a specific response in new audiences, and that response does not require the audience to believe in prophecy to be genuine. It requires only the encounter with the pattern. The pattern does the rest. What intellectual honesty requires, having had the experience and understood its mechanism, is the ability to hold both things simultaneously. The experience was real. The most mundane explanation for the experience is also real. Holding those two things at once without collapsing them into either mysticism or dismissiveness is the appropriate response to a genuinely strange phenomenon, even a phenomenon with mundane roots. Supplemental. Letters to the archive: what future viewers will find. Let us close this extended analysis with a thought experiment that is also a genuine observation. Imagine a viewer watching Family Guy in 2035. They are watching the current seasons, the ones being produced now and through 2029 under the renewal deal. They are watching the cutaway gags go by, the jokes about celebrities and culture and politics, and most of them land as comedy or fall flat as comedy and then are forgotten. But one of those viewers will, at some point, be watching a gag, and will then, years later, encounter a news story that makes the gag feel like something more than a gag. They will search for the clip. They will find it. They will feel the specific electricity of the pattern recognition experience, and they will share it. That process is currently ongoing. It has been ongoing continuously since the Boston Marathon situation put Family Guy's apparent predictions in the public conversation in 2013. New entries to the apparent predictions canon are added periodically as the world catches up to things the show has apparently described. Some of those additions are fabricated, like the Boston Marathon clip, and get corrected over time. Some are real, like the Spacey and Ratner cases, and become permanent parts of the record. The archive of apparent predictions is not a closed set. It will continue to grow as long as the show continues to produce content and the world continues to produce events. The viewers of 2035 will have access to clips that we cannot yet identify as significant because the real-world events those clips describe have not yet occurred. Some of what the show produced in its most recent seasons is already waiting for its confirmation, filed in plain sight, visible to anyone who can read it, invisible to most people who are watching it as comedy. This is the specific quality of a long-running archive of cultural commentary that makes it different from almost any other kind of cultural document. It is not finished. It is not a fixed record of a fixed past. It is an ongoing conversation between a show and a world that is still unfolding, and the conversation will continue for as long as both exist. The people who made the most striking apparent predictions were not, in most cases, trying to make predictions. They were trying to make comedy. The comedy happened to contain information about the world that the world itself had not yet fully processed. And the archive of that comedy is now a permanent part of the cultural record, available to everyone, readable by anyone willing to sit with it long enough to understand what they are actually looking at. That is not prophecy. It is something stranger and more interesting than prophecy. It is a document that continues to reveal itself, a record that is still being written, a show that has been talking to the world for 25 years about things the world is only gradually catching up to understanding. The cartoon was always doing something more than entertainment. The archive is the evidence, and it is still growing. Supplemental: the language of comedy as survival strategy. There is a reason that the specific form of comedy Family Guy uses, the disconnected, deniable, rapidly self-erasing cutaway, is the form in which the most significant apparent predictions survived. It is not an accident of format. It reflects something deep about how uncomfortable knowledge survives in cultures that have not yet found a way to process it directly. Comedy has always been the vessel for truths that the dominant culture cannot hold openly. This is not a modern observation. Aristophanes was doing it in ancient Athens. The court jesters of medieval Europe were doing it. The tradition of the fool who says the thing the king cannot punish runs unbroken from antiquity to Saturday Night Live to a cartoon baby running through a mall in Los Angeles in 2005. What makes comedy particularly effective as a survival mechanism for uncomfortable information is its self-canceling quality. A joke, by the act of being recognized as a joke, signals that it is not meant to be taken literally. The punchline disarms the content. The audience laughs and moves on. The person who made the joke retains deniability. The legal standards department clears the content because no reasonable person would take it as a factual allegation. Everyone understands implicitly that jokes are not depositions, but jokes are also permanent. They are recorded, broadcast, archived, and infinitely reproducible. Every piece of content that has ever aired on American television has been logged in databases, captured on videotape, digitized, and is now accessible in perpetuity through a combination of streaming services, fan archives, and the general inertia of digital culture. A joke that aired in 2005 is as accessible in 2025 as it was the week it aired, and it is accessible to a global audience rather than just the viewers who happen to be watching Fox on that specific Sunday night. This combination, the deniability of comedy and the permanence of broadcast archives, creates a specific kind of document that has no clear historical precedent. In earlier eras of media, a joke told in a comedy special or a late-night monologue would be experienced by a live audience, possibly described in a newspaper review, and then largely lost to history. The joke could be deniable and ephemeral simultaneously. The deniability made it survivable in the moment. The ephemerality meant it posed no lasting threat. Digital archiving changed this. A deniable joke is now also permanent. A joke that passes legal standards and network review in 2005 because it is too absurd to be taken seriously becomes, in 2017, permanent documented evidence of what was known in 2005. The deniability is still technically intact. No one is claiming that Stewie's scream constituted a formal allegation, but the information contained in the joke is now demonstrably part of the public record, with a timestamp in a form accessible to anyone who goes looking for it. Family Guy's apparent predictions exist at the specific intersection of comedy's traditional deniability and digital archiving's novel permanence. The show was using an ancient protective mechanism for uncomfortable information at exactly the moment when that mechanism acquired a new property it had never had before: the ability to survive in the public record indefinitely. That is the specific historical niche. That is the specific thing that makes Family Guy's apparent predictions different from similar jokes made by comedians in earlier eras, jokes that were just as knowing and just as specifically grounded in informal information, but that did not produce a permanent, searchable record of what was known. The archive is the mechanism. Comedy provided the protection. Digital permanence provided the longevity. And the informal information networks of the entertainment industry provided the content. All three had to be present simultaneously for this specific phenomenon to occur, and they were. A final note on watching. One last thing, and then we are done. If you are watching this video as sleep content, as background, as something to let wash over you in the quiet hours of the night, then the level of detail we have gone through together is not necessarily what you were expecting when you pressed play. But there is something appropriate about sitting with all of this in the dark, in the hours when the world is quiet enough to let complicated things settle. The Family Guy predictions are, at their core, A story about the distance between what is known and what is acknowledged. About the information that circulates in informal channels while the formal record maintains a different story. About the things that were true for a long time before they were confirmed, and the ways those things managed to leave marks in public places before the world was ready to read them. That distance between knowledge and acknowledgement is not unique to Hollywood. It is a feature of every environment where power creates asymmetries of information. And the experience of encountering something that was filed in a public archive long before the world was ready to understand it, that is an experience worth sitting with. Not because it changes anything. Not because a cartoon knowing something 12 years before the news broke means the world should have been different, but because it is a reminder that the official record and the actual record are never exactly the same thing. That there are always gaps. That something is always known somewhere before it is known everywhere. And that sometimes if you know where to look, you can find the traces of what was known before the world caught up. That is not a comfortable thought. But it is an honest one. And honesty, even the uncomfortable kind, is usually worth the time it takes. Sleep well. The archive will be there in the morning. End of script. Supplemental. A note on long-running shows and their relationship to time. There is one more dimension worth exploring before we close, and it has to do with what it actually means to produce creative content across a span of 25 or more years. Most cultural products exist in a fixed relationship with their historical moment. A film made in 1985 is a document of 1985. A novel published in 2003 captures the world as it was understood in 2003. These works do not update. They do not continue. They do not add new material as the world changes around them. Their relationship with time is fixed at the moment of their creation. A long-running television show is fundamentally different. It exists across time in a way that no single finished work can. It began somewhere, it is continuing now, and it will end somewhere in the future. And because it is a serial work, adding new material continuously, it has a relationship with the ongoing present that no completed work can have. This creates a strange dynamic when we think about apparent predictions. A film made in 2005 cannot be compared against reality that emerged in 2017 because no new film was added to supplement the comparison. But a television show that ran continuously from 1999 through the present has been adding material to its archive continuously, which means the archive itself is a kind of ongoing record of what the show has been paying attention to across time. Family Guy's archive is therefore not a snapshot. It is a longitudinal document. It records what the show knew and suspected and observed across 2.5 decades of production, not in a single moment, but across hundreds of moments, spread across hundreds of episodes. When we identify apparent predictions within that archive, we are not finding isolated coincidences in a static body of work. We are finding specific moments in an ongoing record that illuminate how the show's relationship with reality changed and evolved over time. The most striking apparent predictions cluster in specific eras. The Me Too adjacent cases come predominantly from the mid-2000s through the early 2010s, the period when the writer's room was most fully embedded in the specific Hollywood social ecosystem that was carrying that information. The cultural analysis cases, the vaccination episode, and the cannabis episode come from periods when the show was engaging most actively with specific policy debates and social trends. The coincidences, the Walker Week, and the BBC Three timing are distributed randomly because coincidences do not follow the patterns of the show's creative development. Reading the archive as a longitudinal document rather than a static one changes how we understand what the show was doing and when it was doing it. The show was not uniformly prescient across its entire run. It was specifically prescient during specific periods for specific reasons. The reasons are human and explainable, but their effects were real and documented. That is the final thing worth understanding about Family Guy's apparent predictions. They are not evidence of a show that transcended time. They are evidence of a show that was, at certain specific moments, paying closer attention to the world around it than most comparable works, and that had the specific structural properties to record what it noticed in a form that could survive in the public archive long enough for the world to catch up. The archive remains. The world is still catching up to parts of it, and the show continues to add new material that some future viewer will one day encounter and feel that specific electricity of recognition. That is what it means to be a 25-year record of a world in motion. That record matters. And it will keep mattering long after the final episode airs and the writer's room closes for the last time.